Welcome back to the channel. This is the second annual quarterback rankings, and this is for 2024. If you are an avid listener of the podcast, which you can go check out on Spotify, I was not doing YouTube videos at the time, but I am now. And last year, one of the first episodes that we did was a quarterback rankings, where we go through and just rank the quarterbacks. Pretty simple, and we do it with Mathis, and I want to make it an yearly trend. So we are back this year. Except this time it's on YouTube, and we got some fun stuff planned for you guys. Should be a good episode, should be really fun. Gonna go back and forth, both ranked, so there'll be my rankings on one side, Mathis's on the other, and of course he has his own channel, Mathis NFL. Please go ahead and check it out. I've done a lot of stuff over there too for draft time, and we will have a lot of episodes in the future, like predicting the NFL season and stuff like that. So thank you, Mathis, for joining us, and I'm excited to get started.
Yeah, I'm ready to go. Pretty in-depth here, 40 quarterbacks, and even more if you count the honorable mention. So let's get going.
Yes, there are a ton of quarterbacks to go through, so I want to make sure that we at least talk about a few, because it's not just like there's 32 quarterbacks and boom, you're done. I think we need to get some room for the backups as well. But just some notes to go through before we start. As we said, 1 through 40 with honorable mentions. If there's a star next to the player, that just determines that they are a backup and they're not the projected week 1 starter. And this is rankings for 2024, and it includes rookies. So this is kind of what we think it's going to play out for 2024 in terms of this is where we think the quarterbacks will fall. And next year we can go ahead and look back on these rankings and see kind of where we had different guys. But first off, let's start with the honorable mentions. We have guys like Mac Jones, Jimmy Garoppolo, Josh Dobbs, Tommy DeVito, Mason Rudolph, Tyler Huntley, Drew Lock, Carson Wentz, Ryan Tannehill, and Jarrett Stidham. These are guys that didn't make either of our lists. There are some on Mathis's list that didn't make mine. There's some on my list that did not make Mathis's, but both of these guys, they didn't make either of our lists. I think Mac Jones was the last guy out for both of us, but I know Jimmy Garoppolo was close. Josh Dobbs, a bunch of those guys. But don't really have a ton to say about them. They didn't make the list, so let's go ahead and get started with the guys that did make the list, starting with 40 through 33. This is right before the starting 32. In terms of what we have, starting with mine, you can go through, read it. Jake Browning, J.J. McCarthy, Aiden O'Connell, Sam Darnold, Andy Dalton, Michael Penix, Kenny Pickett, and Drake May. We have a few similarities here. Mathis has Sam Howell. I don't. He has Joe Flacco, Jake Browning, Jameis Winston, J.J. McCarthy, Aiden O'Connell, Drake May, and Bo Nix. The first things I want to go through here on these two lists are the rookies. I have a good amount of the rookies a bit lower, just because I think there needs to be a little bit just of, not necessarily slowing down, but just caution when it comes to some of these rookies going in and playing. I think just because someone has a starting job doesn't mean they're automatically, obviously, a top 32 quarterback. And I think some of these guys are obviously going to go through rookie slumps in the beginning. And for both of us, you can see one of those guys is Drake May. And we also have J.J. McCarthy on here. I know both of us, at least in terms of our analysis, think that J.J. McCarthy is a bit lower just in general. But he's on a good team. I just don't know if he's going to crack the top. And then we have Drake May, which, Mathis, you can start off with Drake May as to why we kind of agree. You could say kind of your piece on it as to why you don't think he's going to necessarily start in the top 32 going into next year.
Well, as terms of a prospect, we were both fairly high on him during all of our mock drafts. We really liked his talent and what he can become in the NFL. But for right now, I still think he's still has some development in terms of his footwork, his accuracy, just being more consistent as a player. And I think it'll take at least maybe his first season, maybe a little bit more, to really become a refined player. But I think just because of his physical tools, his arm strength, his mobility, his size, I think he's going to be better than some of those, mid-tier backups that I have listed behind, like, Winston, AOC. So I think May, just because of his physical attributes, I still have him ahead of some of those guys. But I think somebody like Bo Nix, who I have just ranked ahead of him, is a little bit more ready to play from day one and should be better as a rookie than Drake May, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't have Bo Nix on this certain slide because I do have him a little bit higher, and it's pretty similar 33, 31, or 2. We're kind of splitting hairs here, but I think I agree. We kind of know Drake May was a bit of a more raw prospect. Bo Nix was more NFL ready, and I know they're both not in amazing situations, but I don't think it's a stretch to necessarily say that Drake May is not in one of the worst situations for a young quarterback. I mean, I know the coaching was kind of a question mark. Who's going to be calling plays there is also kind of a question mark. The weapons around him are not phenomenal. They got a lot of receivers that could be solid on winning teams, but not like wide receiver 1 or 2s, let alone even kind of 3. So that definitely concerns me a little bit. But another guy I think that we both do have on this list, Aiden O'Connell. I believe you had just put out a Raiders episode. Got a lot of views, by the way. I saw that. Congrats to you on that episode. But I think you give a little insight into maybe kind of what the Raiders could expect. I saw the comments, and there were a lot of optimistic Raiders fans in that
Yep.
group saying Aiden O'Connell is the guy. I personally don't necessarily agree. I do think he's better than we thought, obviously, as a
hmm
rookie. He did pretty good for a rookie his first year, but he's like 25. I don't really think he's anything special, and I'm not really sure we're gonna leave this year saying like, yeah, Aiden O'Connell's the franchise quarterback for the Raiders.
No, I don't think so either. I don't even know if he's going to be starting. Like, I think Gardner
Yeah,
Minshew has a
maybe
good
not.
chance. Yeah, I think Gardner Minshew has a good chance to start and play the entire season if the Raiders are competitive and in the playoff race. I think he's interesting because he's one of those guys that doesn't have like great physical attributes, but he's a guy that could be like a game managing type of player that could be like a solid like I don't know, bridge quarterback, kind of like what we see with maybe like a Sam Darnold or like a Jacoby Brissett, who we have listed a little bit differently on our list. But both those guys are just solid, kind of game managing guys that can step in and just be a serviceable player for a year or two. I think AOC has that similar skill set, but in terms of being a guy that like, hey, we're gonna build around him, I don't quite see that, especially because like you mentioned his age, and then I don't think he has like amazing physical attributes as well. And I don't think he was spectacular last year, but definitely pretty good for a mid-round pick coming into a situation middle of the year.
Yeah, maybe he's on this list for the rest of his career, but at the same spot. That's a realistic scenario, but that's kind of what we both feel about him. And then there are 2 guys that I don't think you have on your list that I do have on mine currently on the side, and that's Andy Dalton and Kenny Pickett. For Andy Dalton, I actually had him a little bit higher, but I did move him down, and I think he's a guy that a lot of people forgot about. I think in terms of just comparing backup quarterbacks, I think where I have Andy Dalton, in my opinion of him, is kind of yours with Jameis Winston, because I do not have Jameis Winston on my list. And I think obviously both of them have had limited, playing time, but in 2022, when Andy Dalton was with the Saints, he was actually really solid. Like, he was much better than I think a lot of people thought. It was just because they weren't winning games because the Saints were just super mid. And he did end up playing one game last year where he just looked better than Bryce Young, and the team actually looked like they stood a chance. I believe it was against Seattle. It was on the road, and it was a good game too. Now, I know one game sample size isn't huge, but I think combining that with my thoughts of him in 2022, I do think he deserved a spot on the list, and I think he's a very good backup. Could he be a starter? Maybe not. Maybe he could. There might be some rookies higher than him that I ranked that maybe he's better than, but I do think that some people have kind of forgotten about Andy Dalton, and I think just comparing him with some of the other players in their recent games, like Sam Darnold, Dalton has just played better in the past 2 years than Sam Darnold when they've both gotten chances. Now, I do think Sam Darnold has a good opportunity here, and I could absolutely see him rising. That was the only thing I was worried about putting him so low. Now that he does have another chance with the Vikings, we can talk about him more later because I think you have him higher. But my Andy Dalton and kind of what I think of him is kind of similar to you with Jameis Winston.
Yeah, I thought about having Dalton on my list, and it's a little bit of recency bias why I didn't, because like you said, he didn't really play a ton last year. And I guess the game in Seattle, I do remember watching that game, but I just think if you even go back to Winston when he was playing for the Saints, that was a couple years ago, he was fairly successful with them as well. I mean, he was putting up a really, really good season before he tore his ACL. So I think Winston, just a little bit younger. I still think he has, just a little bit more opportunities or chances for that in the future. I just think right now, if I was going to take a team or someone to be my backup, I would slightly lean towards Winston. But I do feel your argument of having Dalton, just paying him a little bit of respect to have him towards the back end of your list. I just thought some of these other guys, just taking into account their age, also what they can do in the next couple years, I just thought, hey, I would prefer to have one of those guys ahead of them.
Yeah, maybe if Jameis finally gets his 2020 vision that he had talked about, maybe that could help him boost his ratings on this list. Kenny Pickett was the other guy that I had. I don't think you had him on your list, did you?
Nope.
No.
I,
So what? You go ahead.
I had him in my honorable mentions. I'm not a huge fan of Kenny Pickett. He's just one of those guys again that doesn't have a super strong skill set. And even when you go back to his first couple years in the NFL, when you're a guy that doesn't have a super strong arm, when you don't have great size, when you can't move super well, you need to win in other areas. And it's not like Pickett was super accurate. He did not have great completion percentages. It's not like he was a great anticipatory thrower. So I don't really think he has like many skill sets that are super applicable to NFL starters or NFL quarterbacks. And I just don't even think out of any of these guys, if I wanted to have a backup quarterback to step in and win me a game, I don't think I would take Kenny Pickett over any of these guys necessarily, just off of what he has done the first couple years of his career with the Steelers. Maybe he turns things around with the Eagles, and maybe if he gets some opportunities with their weaponry, he does better. But I just am not a fan of what Kenny Pickett has done. Also, it's just his attitude and all his drama with the Steelers as well. I kind of take that into consideration as well when judging how I want my backup quarterback to act. So I kind of put all those things into consideration to not have him as my top 40 quarterback.
Yeah. So understandable for especially the attitude thing. That definitely doesn't help, I would say. But I do think him going to the Eagles slightly played a factor into me having him a little bit higher. I would have had him in the list regardless, but I think him being with the Eagles does help. And I think if you just step back and look at Kenny Pickett's objective just career so far, I think he's kind of had a pretty unlucky experience. Now, obviously in Pittsburgh it was horrible. I think he obviously in his rookie year he definitely got unlucky with interceptions. I think that was something that or at least I had definitely noted last year. There were multiple plays where if you just look at all his interceptions from last year, there were tip passes, there were, throwaways that ended up, the receiver just like stopped running and then the defender went to go pick it off and it really made it look worse than it actually was. And then he got injured and then boom, he was done. He also had Matt Canada, who probably has been the worst OC in the NFL when he was hired. Literally the worst. So I don't think that helps a ton. Kenny Pickett, I think, and Deontay Johnson, both, they were solid wide receivers, but after, Deontay Johnson, had been injured, it was kind of just the Kenny Pickett show, and he's a good wide receiver, but I think Steelers fans overrate him just a little bit. I don't think he's as much of a bona fide wide receiver one as people kind of want to make it seem. His O-line was very poor. There's a reason they just drafted like 2 to 3 offensive linemen the past 2 years. It's bad, and it needed to get better. And the running game with, Najee Harris, maybe he'll be better this year, but it's just been like not insane. So he hasn't really had a ton of stuff around him. His OC has sucked, and I know he hasn't been amazing, but his turnover-worthy play percentage was like near the bottom last year. And I don't know. I think when I kind of just look at a lot of his stuff, I think he kind of got the bad end of the stick. And I think if he goes to Philadelphia, I wouldn't be surprised if Hurts get injured, he comes in and plays a little bit with his mobility and just fits right in and maybe does good and might get a second contract. Now, that doesn't mean I think he'll be super successful after that. We have no clue. But I do want to give him a little bit of leeway because I do think he kind of had a poor experience there in Pittsburgh. But that is probably the last guy we can go into. Jake Browning had a good, a good fill-in here. But, I mean, he was near the bottom in average depth of target. but he was top 6 in yards per attempt, meaning it was really just the weapons that were absolutely, I think, carrying him. But I did have to put him in just because he had a relatively successful season. But I don't think he was anything crazy there.
Browning is a guy that had pretty good numbers, brought the Bengals to, have some pretty key wins down the stretch, which, maybe wasn't super good because he kind of messed up their draft position. But you were right. He didn't really have to do too much. It was a lot of screen passes, a lot of checkdowns to some of those playmakers. Really good offensive scheme by Zach Taylor to kind of help him out. But I do think he showed that he's a serviceable backup. And, the Bengals crossing their fingers that they don't need him again. But he might be a player that, once again, has to step on the field if Joe Burrow cannot stay upright.
Yeah, and I think that will probably do it for this half of the list. There are a few guys we didn't fully get into, but I think that's because other people have them on their list a little bit higher. So we'll just let them go ahead and speak on that when we get to it. So now we are going to go ahead and move to the next part of the list, and that is 32 through 28. And as you can see, starting off with my list, I have Jaden Daniels at 32. I believe you have him a little bit higher on your list. I have Deshaun Watson at 31, Bo Nix at 30, Tyrod Taylor at 29, and Joe Flacco at 28. You have Sam Darnold, Jacoby Brissett, Will Levis, Daniel Jones, and Michael Penix on your side. Now, obviously, if you could not tell, I did have the rookies a little bit lower. I kind of already went into that. But in terms of guys that you had a little bit higher, that can be Sam Darnold and Daniel Jones, because I do not have Daniel Jones higher than 28. I don't even have him on my list. That is how much I do not like Daniel Jones. But the two guys I just mentioned, Mathis, Sam Darnold and Daniel Jones, tell me why you had those two guys higher. One of them I do, understand and get. But tell me what you're thinking behind those two.
So Darnold, yeah, you touched on a little bit, just going to a good spot with, the Minnesota Vikings, all of their weaponry, Kevin O'Connell as his head coach. I think he will be, at least a solid quarterback for however long he starts. I don't know when J.J. McCarthy's going to take over, but I still think with that weaponry, he has the tools to produce, be a good player this year. So I wanted to have him at least the tail end of my starting quarterbacks, at 32. And Daniel Jones at 29, I do get kind of the, hatred or the dislike for Daniel Jones, but only thing I kind of remember from him, because last year was just such a train wreck for the Giants, but only thing I really remember is 2 years ago when he had a fairly good season, probably the best of his career in terms of just team success and playing winning football. His turnovers were down. He brought the Giants to the playoffs, and then I think he had like a 300-yard passing game against the Vikings. And yeah, that was a pretty bad defense. I think like one of the worst passing defenses like we've seen in the last like 5 years or so. But I still think Daniel Jones, when you just compare him to other quarterbacks that are in this range, I still think with at least his experience, we'll see how he returns off his ACL, but his athleticism, I mean, he's a fairly athletic guy. And I still think that maybe his situation also hasn't been super favorable like his entire career. We'll see now with Malik Neighbors coming in, if that can help him produce a little bit more and stay a little bit more consistent. But I just like Daniel Jones a little bit more than I feel like, I mean, I guess you do on this list, but I just feel like I like him a little bit more than the majority of people in terms of, not having him as like, oh yeah, this guy should be out of the league. I think Daniel Jones is at least a serviceable bridge type quarterback. I don't think he's like going to emerge into being an elite guy. I never had him in like my top 12 quarterbacks, like some people did after that playoff run I mentioned. But I still think he deserves some respect to be towards the back end of starting quarterbacks just because of some of the moments that he's had in his NFL career. But we will see how he returns from a severe injury.
Yeah, so I did lie earlier. Daniel Jones was, I think, the second to last person I left off. The other one was Ryan Tannehill, two guys that just barely missed the list. And I think my reasoning just for not having him high is obviously 2022 you look at and you're like, okay, well, that was pretty good. First of all, it was a solid year for him. In general, it was like, okay. Didn't have a ton of touchdowns at all. He did cut down on the turnovers, but I think a lot of that really was, I view Brian Daboll very highly, and I think was a pretty major reason for that. And I think it was Saquon Barkley, one of his best years of his career, so that helped a ton. And I think if I just look at last year, he had two guys play better than him. Tommy DeVito and Tyrod Taylor objectively played better than Daniel Jones when all three of them were on the field. Obviously, Daniel Jones got injured, but he didn't really get injured and then keep playing. He got injured and then just kind of stopped. They had backups that went in for him. And I think, in my opinion at least, I'm pretty confident this is his last year in New York. I think he will end up being a backup after this season. Maybe he proves me wrong. Obviously, he could if he has a good year. Like you said, he's got more, receiving weapons now, although his running game is definitely worse. And I think he just had a lot of it was just bad throwing the ball last year. His running game is always pretty good. Kind of like Pickett, but I guess that's what you could say. Your Daniel Jones is my Kenny Pickett. But I think his mobility is what keeps him still somewhat viable. But I wouldn't be surprised if Locke plays at some point this year, whether it's due to injury or just bad play. We didn't plan this, by the way. We didn't plan the list at all. So it's kind of funny that I had one Giants quarterback at 29. You had the other one at 29. But when I looked at Tyrod Taylor's stuff, I was just kind of shocked how well he played. He was first in big-time throw percentage, which if you hear me say big-time throw or turnover-worthy play, that's a stat that kind of determines like throws that were just like great and perfect and plays that the quarterback made that should have or could have resulted in a turnover. Obviously, that doesn't always happen. But he was first in terms of the percentage of times that he made a great throw, which was pretty shocking. And he was last in turnover-worthy plays of quarterbacks who were eligible. You had to have thrown a certain amount of passes. So it's not just like a guy plays one game, he doesn't throw a bad pass, and boom, he's number one. All the stats I say are based on if they, fit the criteria. So he was first in the best and last in the worst. So that's pretty good. And I think of teams with a bottom 10 receiving core, the Giants had the second best quarterback grade. And that was obviously with Tyrod and DeVito and Daniel Jones, but I think Tyrod and DeVito were definitely more of a factor in that in that stat being true over Daniel Jones. His average depth of target was top 5, so he wasn't just throwing dump offs like Jake Browning. The Giants had the worst rated pass blocking and receiving core, one of the worst, not the absolute worst, but it was very bad. He could be higher, to be honest, just going off this last year, but I definitely can't do that because, like you had talked about before the recording, he does have injuries and he's older, so we don't know if he's going to stay the same. But I wanted to really give him his flowers because his stats were much better than I had thought. And going back and looking, him doing that with the roster that he had, I think is pretty impressive. Obviously, I do think highly of Daboll, and that happened, partly because of him. But that's kind of our two Giants quarterbacks rankings there. And then I had Flacco, kind of similar. At Tyrod and Flacco, I did have much higher. I think you had Flacco at 38, if I'm correct. I think you're 39.
Yeah.
Flacco at 39, yeah. So I'm at 38, and you can see I have him higher than the other Browns quarterback, Deshaun Watson, because I'm done. I'm sick of Deshaun Watson. I'm pissed off. I hate him right now. I'm done. I'm done with Deshaun Watson. He needs to earn his spot. If he wants to be anywhere near the middle, he needs to play like it. Because it's been, when was the year? Was it 2019? With the
2020,
Texans?
I think 2020 he was good individually, but the Texans I think won like 3 games that year.
2020, which he was he was great. But 2020, since then, since 2020, he has had like 2 solid games. I'm not since 2020, or practically since 2020, but I'm talking about last year. He had 2 solid games when he played, and I mean solid, not like very good or good, solid. And they were both versus the 2 bottom 5 defenses, Tennessee and Arizona. And he had multiple times since he's been on the Browns where he had QBs that played better than him. Joe Flacco and Jacoby Brissett, both of which I do have higher than him on this list because they straight up went into the same exact team on the same exact year at the same time and just played better than him. like just straight up. He was much better in 2022 than he was in 2021, which was his first year there after 2020 when, that whole thing happened. But he's just got to earn it if he wants to go any higher. He could definitely go higher. I could see it happening. But he's got the worst contract in football, which obviously that doesn't fully play into the rankings, but it does play into when the Browns need to start signing some of the players that they have because the roster itself is very good. It's going to suck because they're going to have Watson's contract on the books. And I think just looking at the two objectively between Flacco, props to him. He had a big resurgence. A lot of them were kind of just major gunslinging plays. So it was kind of like it's a touchdown or a pick. But I think that was just way more successful than whatever Watson was trying to do. So I know you don't have him crazy high, but you do have him higher than me. We can see where you have him later. But that's kind of my thinking into the much lower Deshaun Watson rankings.
So I'll touch on the last three quarterbacks you just mentioned, starting with Tyrod Taylor. If there's any quarterback probably on this list that I didn't have, that he would probably be the one that I would probably be talked into having somewhere on my list. I probably wouldn't have him in my 20s. I mean, I guess yours is at 29, but I still probably wouldn't have him quite that high. But I do feel your argument of just having a really solid guy that's been around the block multiple times. I do see your argument there. The thing that did concern me with Tyrod Taylor is, as you mentioned, his age and his injury. And also, I feel like if you just take into account his sample size for, some of those, the past couple years where he stepped in, it's not like a super big sample size. Like it's only been, spots here or there before he, inevitably gets hurt, so I didn't really have him really any consideration to be in, I guess maybe around 40, 39 or in my honorable mention, but I didn't have him anywhere close to, where you had him simply because of, you just can't rely on him and he's not going to be a starter ever again. So I just didn't think for a backup quarterback that can't really stay healthy or play, I wouldn't want him that high. Joe Flacco, I had him at 39. And the main thing about him is just, again, I don't want to be super recency bias on, a lot of these picks. And before last season's mirage from Flacco, the last 4 or 5 years prior to that, he was not good at all. He was arguably, one of the worst quarterbacks to start in the game. I remember playing for
the Jets. He didn't do terrible. I know he's in the Jets uniform now.
Well,
for the Jets, I know he had a few games there.
Well, I from my experiences, because I watched him play the Dolphins several times. I mean, he was pretty awful in those games. I mean, they couldn't even score a touchdown most times when he was playing. So just from what I remember of Flacco, in a Jets uniform, I just didn't think he was that good at all. And so maybe he's closer. I mean, I guess you got to take into account, he's probably somewhere in the middle of what we saw last year versus what he was with, the Jets and those other teams he was a journeyman on. So maybe he could be a little bit higher in the 30s, but I think that's kind of where I had him on my list, but not too high. And then quickly on Deshaun Watson.
Before you get to Watson, just the two, I do think I see what you mean to have them lower. I think the reason I had them higher is because when I saw they're not playing on the 49ers. And I think that's why I had them higher, because both of them do have good coaches, but they're vets. The coaching is very good for young players. As it keeps going, the older they get, the more it's hey, I also know this too. I think I just had them higher because I saw what each of them had. The Browns' weapons, it's Amari Cooper and David Njoku are solid. Outside of that, there wasn't really a receiver there that was doing a bunch of stuff. And with the Giants, they obviously had terrible. So I think that's why I had him higher. And I just wanted to, maybe part of it was respect, but personally, I would still have them in the top 32. I would maybe at most move them down 31 to 32. But that's just kind of my thing there. We can end the two things there. But you can go on with Watson.
Watson, I definitely get your statement about him. I mean, he's just been a really kind of just an annoying player to talk about and follow along with the last 4 years. I mean, it's just been so much stuff, and he's really just never been on the field with his suspension, his injuries. It's just been a whole just long journey with him. And so the reason why I have him a little bit higher than you, I won't say exactly where since we're not there yet. I'm just banking, I'm projecting a little bit of him just being an okay quarterback. Like I'm not banking on him being like what he was in Houston, but I did think his last game against the Baltimore Ravens before he got hurt, I did think that was probably the best he looked in a Browns uniform when you consider the opponent. He was on the road and he kind of willed the Browns to that victory. So I just kept that in the back of my head when considering him, but I do also kind of agree with what you mentioned with Joe Flacco, how he really brought the Browns to the playoffs after Flacco was hurt. I mean, after Watson got hurt. So that's another thing to take into account, but I'm just kind of projecting with Watson a little bit. I'm still kind of reminiscing on what he was in Houston, which I don't think he's going to return to that form, but can he get somewhat close to that? I guess we'll see. This is kind of it could be his last year to really prove it before the Browns just say, hey, you know what? We're going to do what the Broncos did and just dump this guy. It's just not worth having this guy on the roster. So we'll see, but yeah.
Would be another like colossal, just like
oh yeah, for sure,
funny QB miss by the Browns.
Yeah,
but I would understand if you have him like, I think the highest I would put him, if I'm being realistic, is like 26, 25, somewhere around there in terms of saying a little bit projection, which I can do projection and have him up there, and that's kind of what this list is supposed to be. I just looked more in and was just like, dude, this guy is just, I hate it. So I wanted to give, he needs to be punished. He needs to be punished. He needs to be down here. And when I just looked, I was like, I also, I had to have Flacco ahead of him. I just had to, just because it was the same thing. And that's why I had Brissett ahead of him.
Yeah.
That's why I had Brissett. And I think part of it is why I had Flacco is because they had Dorian Thompson-Robinson and P.J. Walker, which P.J. Walker, if you don't know, on the Panthers had some pretty solid games there. Mm-hmm. They were both horrible. They were horrendous when they played. And then Flacco came in and he was good with the same roster. So I think that's also kind of why I had him boosted up. But if I understand Watson's placing a little higher, it could totally happen. It's also, like you said, hasn't stayed healthy. Mm-hmm. I don't think he'll ever get close to what he was, but maybe someone good. It's always going to be looked at in a bad light. One, obviously just because of who he is. But two, because the Browns roster is going to slowly start getting worse because his contract is absurd. And it's fully guaranteed, the most guaranteed money. And as a Panthers fan, I'm so glad we did not trade for him because the whole NFC South was going for him. I remember when it was happening. And the Browns were the first team that was like apparently out of the list in terms of where Deshaun Watson was going to go. It got down to like the Saints and the Falcons. And then boom, the Browns gave him fully guaranteed. And the rest is apparently history. But I think if he plays like somewhat to what he could have, the Browns could like have a roster to win the division. Like that's totally possible. They made the playoffs last year. If they just have some semblance of consistent play, it's there. But I think a good part of that is hinging on Chubb because I know he's still recovering and had
severe knee injury.
There. Yeah, that really sucked for him. But we'll see how that goes. But that's kind of it for this. I didn't really touch on Jaden Daniels. I think you have him higher, right?
Yeah, slightly. Yeah.
If I go through, so we'll touch on him next.
You want me to
Michael
talk
Penix?
About? Yeah, you want to talk about him at all?
Yeah. Michael Penix is the other one. I think obviously if you've looked at any of the draft stuff, it was just laughing at the Falcons. But I think, what did I have him? I had him like 35.
Yeah.
So not really. I mean, it seems like a big difference, but I don't think it is a ton. I just think he also could learn a little bit. Maybe if I'm doing a little bit of projection, if he's like if he plays one game or something and looks okay, I could totally see him moving up to like 32 because I do think he could be a starting caliber quarterback. Again, my thing was just I wanted to give praise to the guys who did play and are up there, and I think there's a reason we had mocked him to be the last of the core quarterbacks taken, but he wasn't. Yep. He obviously ended up going higher. Totally forgot. But I had him lower. Well, why did you have him a little bit higher?
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit higher on Penix than you were, like in the draft process. I just think when you just watch him play, I mean, I just during like the college football playoffs last year, I was just really impressed with him, especially on the big stage. He made some throws in the Michigan game, although he was not great through the entirety of that game, which was, I think Michigan by far was, the best team coaching wise, roster wise. So it wasn't really a super fair fight, but I still think Penix showed flashes in those games against Texas and Michigan, two really, really good powerhouse schools. And I just think Penix has a chance to be a really good NFL quarterback. I do think he has a chance to be really, really good. I think he also is a little bit more pro ready than a lot of people think because he does have a lot of experience because he was in college for a long time due to some of those injuries he suffered, which is a concern, might have been why he was off some teams' boards and why people had him maybe projected to go lower than he actually went, which was top 10 to the Falcons, which definitely was a little bit higher for my liking, but I still viewed him as a first round player, probably a mid first round pick. I just think with his arm talent, I think he has a chance again to be somebody that would be a really nice pocket passer. He doesn't have great mobility, although he tested well. If you just kind of watch him, he's kind of a laboring kind of speed. He's not, just super agile and stuff, but straight line speed, I guess he could be all right. But I just think Penix, he could, I guess, be a viable option for the Falcons, but I don't think he's even going to play next year unless Kirk has an injury or a setback with his Achilles. But I just kind of like Penix as a prospect. So that's why I have him a little bit higher than you did. But I mean, we're not too far off. I mean, 35, 28, that's not too big of a difference.
No. I mean, yeah. I mean, I was lower. If you don't, obviously a lot of you haven't listened to my podcast that I'd done throughout the whole college season. Michigan and Washington were the two teams that I was like, I like these two teams the best. Georgia's right in the group with them. One of these three is going to win it all. And Washington, I did pick them to beat, I think it was Bama who they played. I can't remember who they played. Or no, who did they? Texas.
Yeah, Texas.
Texas who they played. Yeah. It was just, I did think Penix was a first round caliber quarterback. It was obviously just the stuff of his, he's not the tallest, but it's also just like had a ton of, literally so many injuries beforehand. In terms of his play, he had some amazing receivers. All three of them are in the NFL. He had 2 tackles that are in the NFL now. So that definitely helped. Obviously, his coach just got hired to replace Nick Saban at Alabama.
Yep.
So he had a phenomenal infrastructure. But he did play well, especially the deep ball. I think he has a great deep ball. He was just throwing over the middle, was not great. And
he didn't do that a ton. Yeah.
A little, kind of flustered there. And I do still like him. That was kind of my reasoning for having him a little bit lower. But I just would have loved if he would have, or not loved, but I just would have much preferred if he went to like the
team
Raiders
where he could play.
Seahawks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like the Raiders, he's the number 1 quarterback, I think, in my opinion, if he's on that team.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And if he's the Seahawks, he could sit for a year.
Take over
and
for
potentially
Gino.
fight to be the starter. Like, I would have preferred so many other options.
For sure.
Yeah, I hate what they did. It was just very terrible. But, I don't want to take away anything from him. But the only thing is, like, he's probably going to be around here until he plays.
Yeah.
Which, if we're being realistic, like, Kirk Cousins could, if he doesn't get injured, because there are definitely players that get hurt 1 year and then don't get hurt another year.
Yeah.
He could go 3 years without playing, 2 years.
Yeah, I think it would likely be those 2 years because I think his guaranteed money is 2 years. So it would likely, if he doesn't get hurt, it's probably going to be 2 years, and then they hand over the reins to Penix in year number 3.
26?
27 maybe? 27 years old?
Like, this is not... I already went over this on episodes. Go listen to the episode stuff. This is not Jordan Love. This is not what it is. They saw it, they wanted to do it, and they did not do it the correct way.
Yeah.
But still, nothing to take away from him. Still a good player, and we'll see what he does. I kind of hope he gets a chance.
Yep.
And then going to 27 through 23, as I had mentioned, I do have Jacoby Brissett higher. I have him at 27. Russell Wilson at 26 and Justin Fields at 25. And I have Anthony Richardson at 24 and Will Levis at 23. That might be a little shocking to some. He is at 30 for Mathis. I have him at 23. Mathis has Jaden Daniels at 27, Bryce Young at 26, Gardner Minshew at 25, Russell Wilson at 24, and Anthony Richardson at 23. Now, a side note, he did forget Justin Fields. So I think... you want to put him kind of around Gardner Minshew?
Yeah, I wanted to have him
25B.
Yeah, that works. I wanted to have him behind Russ because I do think Russ from day one for the Steelers is going to be the starter. So I'm just gonna, because of that, mainly just gonna have Fields behind him. But I think 25, yeah.
Yeah, that was so. Imagine if you want to move everyone down one, we didn't really want to do that, so we'll just say 25 is kind of split between the two. Um, not this list is a little bit closer than normal. We have two guys
Yeah.
that are literally three guys that are on the same exact area. So we can start off with them first, starting with Russell Wilson. The only big discrepancy we have is we have them flipped. I have Fields over Russ. You have Russ over Fields. Now, the reason I'd done that is because the more I looked into Russell, the more just a little bit worried I was, because I do think Sean Payton kind of got the most out of what he is right now, in my opinion. And while I do think that the weapons there weren't amazing, I think or at least in terms of Denver, I think the O-line was pretty good. And I think that Sean Payton knows how to use the weapons he has. And if you're going to the Steelers, is it that much better? I guess, yeah. But it's not an insane amount. And the O-line, I would say, is younger and worse. So I think if you're just looking at that, I think that fits a little bit more with maybe what Fields is better at. So that's why he might end up starting. I do have the asterisks on him because it seems like Russ might be the day one starter. But I think he's only going to get less athletic, and his pure throwing ability is okay at the moment. It is obviously better than Fields, but just objectively, if that falls off a bit, him using his athleticism was a big part of his playing in terms of him going around the pocket, moving around, trying to get the ball out, and having these great on-the-run throws, whereas Fields is obviously not as good of a thrower. He has his bevy of issues, but I just think as a runner and just a playmaker, I think that might be more valuable for the Steelers, and I wouldn't be surprised if sometime he does a little better. I don't think he's going to explode into some kind of Pro Bowl quarterback like a lot of these Bears fans and all these other fans seem to think he is, because I think people envision, hey, I thought Justin Fields was going to be really good. He still is, because I thought he would be. I think a lot of people are kind of blinded by that. That's kind of my take, at least with how he was. Like, oh, he fell in the draft. He was in a bad spot. Like, I think we had talked about this. The idea they would keep him and trade the first pick is one of the stupidest things I've ever heard in my life. Or taking Marvin Harrison 1 and it was so dumb. They had an awesome draft. Getting Caleb and Rome. Bears are going to be great, hopefully, for the next few years, at least for their sake. But I that's kind of why I had him ahead. We can get it Anthony Richardson later. But what's your take on Russ and Fields?
Yeah, I think you really hit home a lot of similar points. I really just came down to day one, first game of the NFL season. I'm just going to try and win a game. I do think I'd give a slight edge to Russell Wilson at this point. I just think, his athleticism, as you mentioned, is kind of wearing down a little bit. He's not extending plays as well as he used to. His deep pass did suffer a little bit last season. He wasn't as accurate down the field, but I still think he still has a great, deep pass. And with George Pickens, I still think that could be a lethal combination for the first couple of weeks of the season. And I also do like the system that he's going to be running with Arthur Smith. If you go back to his time in Tennessee with Ryan Tannehill, he kind of had a resurgence with Tannehill there. And they utilized Derrick Henry a lot. And although, the Steelers don't have Derrick Henry, they do have a good duo of running backs with Najee Harris.
Kind of similar, yeah.
Yeah, Najee Harris and Jalen Warren.
Both are pretty good.
So I do think that system's going to rely on play action a lot. They're going to get Russell Wilson kind of on the move a little bit, allow him to utilize his strengths. So I do think Russ could have a fairly good season. I do like also that you mentioned that Sean Payton really did get the most out of Russell. I know if you look at his stats, it was like, oh, wow, Russ, he had a great statistical season last year. He might be a top 15 quarterback. No, if you watched him play and you kind of saw what he was asked to do, he was not asked to do a whole lot. It was kind of, check downs here or there. And, Sean Payton kind of had a leash on him. So I don't think Russ is, anywhere close to what he used to be. But I just think for right now, I still think he's a serviceable quarterback. And we'll see. I do think at some point, because how hard the Steelers schedule is, I do think Justin Fields will play at some point. It's not an if, it's a when for me. I do think he will be playing. So maybe by the end of the season, Fields turns out to be, hey, he's better than Russ at this point. But I just think at the start of the season, I'll just give a slight edge to Russ. But it's not like a huge difference. I mean, we have him one spot. We just have him flip-flopped. So, I mean, it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, it was just mine was just at the end of the year. Who do I think is going to be better? And I
Yeah.
just think
Okay.
mine was more so. I think Russ will be downgrading, and I think Fields will be insanely upgrading.
I buy that.
That was
Yeah.
kind of my
Okay.
yeah. That was kind of my thinking. But I do think even just thinking like with Arthur Smith, like you had said with Tannehill, I do think Fields
Yeah.
is not the same, but I think he fits that a little more because I do think I am concerned about Russ's full athletic ability at this point in his career with him being what mid 30s, you know.
Yeah. Smith
That's
could
the only
definitely help
thing.
out Fields. Yeah. That could be another
Yeah, and I
interesting fit
think
too.
I honestly, the more I talk about it, the more I'm like, screw it. Bo Nix is ahead of Russ because he'll do better in year one. But maybe after year two, maybe I'm sure if we do this list next year, we might end up having Nix
Oh yeah.
a
There'll be a
spot
lot
or
of
two ahead of.
there's always a
Yeah,
few different changes. Yeah.
potentially. I didn't want to get too far ahead of myself.
Yeah.
And do full projections, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. And then there's Anthony Richardson, which I actually did move up a little bit right before recording. I had him a little bit lower. I did boost him ahead of the two guys below him, and we are pretty similar on him in terms of him taking some sort of step up. Now, the only reason I had him lower was because I think he's kind of just getting his rookie year this year, which is really unfortunate. But it was the worst possible start because in terms of him playing, him throwing the ball, it wasn't amazing, but it was better than what I think was at least expected of him because he was super raw. And running was like, yeah, he's going to be great. But he gets hurt pretty early, and I would be lying if I said I wasn't a little bit scared because that's clearly the basis of his whole game. And he is like relatively built and he's tall. But, I think the reason I convinced myself to move him up is because I just really like the situation with Steve Sarkisian. And the weapons look good. I think they got a pretty good steal in the second round with A.D. Mitchell. And we'll see kind of how he does with them now. But with Josh Downs, who I think is a good slot receiver, and obviously Pittman got paid. And they have a group of tight ends that are young. And I actually kind of like them, Jelani Woods and the guys in there. But the O-line looks pretty good. I like the OC, the play calling. I think he's just got to develop. And I think we both are kind of ranking him at where he will peak next year. But I think both of us just love the potential. It's just unfortunate. I think he's kind of starting his rookie year this year.
I will say about Richardson, I don't really think this is his peak for me. This might kind of shock you, but I really do think Richardson could be like the next superstar quarterback if he can stay healthy.
No, I'm talking about like at the end of this year.
Like this
I do
upcoming
think maybe,
season?
Yeah,
I think he could be
if we're
higher
ranking
than
the
23.
next if we're ranking like quarterbacks in the next 5 years, I could see him being top 10. I could see that. I could also see him being low. But
Okay. Well, I'm
my
just saying
my ranking was kind of like at the end of this year because I, in my opinion, I do think he's kind of getting his first real rookie season.
Okay. Well, see, my thing about him is injuries is definitely a concern because even you go back to him at Florida, he had some injuries there as well. And his play style, just because of, just his dual threat ability to run as well. And that is a concern if he can stay healthy for sure. He had concussions, he tore his labrum. So that's something to keep an eye on. But as you mentioned, his situation is ridiculous. And I like his weaponry. You mentioned Downs as a good slot receiver, the little safety blanket, middle of the field. You've got A.D. Mitchell. You've got Michael Pittman Jr. The offensive line is fairly good as well. Shane Steichen, I think Shane Steichen, I think he might be already a top 5 offensive mind in the league with what he did with Jalen Hurts and Philadelphia. Having Hurts really pretty much making Hurts his career. I mean, we'll get to Hurts in a little bit, but before Steichen showed up, Hurts was not a great he wasn't an MVP caliber player. Steichen comes along, is the OC. He's the runner-up for MVP. Steichen leaves, and we saw what Hurts was last year. So I think Steichen is a really, really good player. I mean, really, really good play caller. We saw what he did last year with Gardner Minshew as well, having the Colts almost in the playoffs with, many see as, a backup quarterback. That's kind of why I have Minshew ranked where I have him, because I feel like Minshew is a really good backup. But I think Steichen did a great job getting the most out of him as well. So I think Richardson has the opportunity, and with all of his skill set, his size, his arm strength, his athleticism, I think Richardson has a chance to be a superstar. I really, really do. It just really comes down to the injuries and how he can develop. But from everything that I hear and really read up on and see about the Colts, I think Richardson has that, the work ethic and all the intangibles that you would really like out of a player to really progress. And I'm really, really high on him becoming a really, really good player. But we'll see. It really comes down to those injuries. You really can't control those sometimes. But yeah,
Yeah, if he reaches his peak, he's like a fantasy, obviously, monster.
yeah.
I would even pick him in fantasy this year. But again, only thing that scares me is injuries. And if you're injured, you don't get time to throw. And if you don't get time to throw, it's going to take longer to progress. Luckily for him, he's younger, but
Yep.
I think he's got a pretty good infrastructure. And it's funny you bring up Sark with Minshew because that's part of the reason why I don't even have him on my list. His throwing grade was not amazing, and just watching some of the games, it was kind of just like they're winning in spite of him. He did make some great throws, obviously, but I think in terms of him compared to Flacco, Flacco made more great throws and less crazy ones than Minshew did. But that's kind of why I didn't really
Yeah,
have him
Minshew
on the
also just
list
kind of
there.
went back to his time in Jacksonville as well. I just think he has a pretty deep resume as stepping in and being a pretty solid option. Maybe the advanced metrics and stuff don't necessarily favor him a ton, but I do think if you just kind of take everything into account, like his career as a whole as well, I do think he's one of the better backups in the league, just in terms of what he's able to provide. I mean, he's got some ability. He doesn't have a huge arm, but he can make most throws that you need him to do. So I'm pretty high on Gardner Minshew. Actually, I think
Yeah, I was
like
gonna say 25
yeah,
because O'Connell's like in the. Seems like you're pretty confident. Like, oh yeah, he's much
yeah,
better.
I think Gardner Minshew should definitely be the starter for the Raiders starting week 1, but we'll see if that comes to fruition or not.
Yeah, and then the other guy that I have here, I think you had him lower, was Jacoby Brissett, and this is kind of my guilty pleasure a little bit. I think he's had multiple times where he's gone somewhere, got benched, and played better than the person that started over him. One of them I understand, which was Tua in 2021, because he was, the rookie there. The other one was, Deshaun Watson in 2022. He was just straight up better than him. And Watson started over just because he got paid in what we know now is a terrible trade and contract. He got limited pass attempts last year, but he produced on Washington. He was like Sam Howell was in there, and nothing was really going on, which he was running for his life. But he had good throws in games when Brissett started, and then over his 19 games in the past 3 years, he has around the same passer rating as Trevor Lawrence, and he has a better passer rating than Watson does in 2021 and in 2022. In both games, in both years, 2021 and 2022, so not last year because he didn't really play, he was near the top in drop percentage. In 2021, I believe he was second in terms of percentage of passes that are dropped by wide receivers. Now he's on the Patriots, which they don't have the best infrastructure or offensive support. But I kind of expect Brissett to do better than other people think. But I think he's going to get to a point where he's not doing bad enough to fully bench, but they'll still bench him because they want May in. And that might be like a third year in a row where he doesn't play too bad, and the guy that plays over him does better. But I understand because it's a top quarterback. But I think he's gone to multiple places and proven to be a pretty good guy after that stint with the Colts. I think he, developed a good amount when he was in Indianapolis and having to be pushed out and start, after Andrew Luck. And this is kind of I would understand if you had him lower. I think he's been kind of better than people think there. And then in terms of, the I'd say two young guys. I have one on mine that's much higher. Both of the young guys I have higher. One of them you have showing on your list now. The other one I believe was 30 for you. And we can start off with Will Levis. I am low-key expecting or could really see like a second year, like quote-unquote boom from Will Levis. He had very high highs last season. Now he did have low lows, but he had very high highs with the worst pass protecting offensive line in the NFL. He had games like the Miami game, which you obviously remember, because I remember watching it, which I was very shocked about. And he also had the Atlanta game, where he was very, very good as well. In terms of big time throw percentage, he was top 5. His average depth of target was first. So he is really chucking it down the field. He was top 5 in drop percentage. So had a lot of throws that were ended up being dropped by his receivers. He absolutely had accuracy issues, totally. I think he was first in terms of just bad throw percentage, or just like accuracy. I think was the lowest in terms of quarterbacks who played a certain amount of games, at like 68% or something like that. But I think with the offense much improved, with Callahan calling plays, who I do think highly of, because I think Jake Browning, he did a very good job in terms of trying to be successful with Jake Browning. I think he's going to have high highs, but he's also going to have low lows. But I think he's going to improve if he could just get more consistent. I see the big passes, I see the big plays, and I think there are quarterbacks that are at the very top of our list that also aren't the most accurate or totally have a ton of bad plays, but they do these crazy things, and that's why we have them so high. You could insinuate who we're talking about, but we'll get to them later. That's kind of what I'm thinking with Levis, and I was very impressed. I wasn't super high on him because, at least last year, because during the draft, there were these Reddit rumors that he should go number 1, and I was like, what? No. But now that I look at it, not saying he should have gone number 1, obviously, but even when the draft happened, he totally should not have been a second-round pick. I think both of us know that, and I think they got a pretty good deal, him in the second round. And I didn't love their draft, but in free agency, I think they spent a lot of money and got a lot of good players. I know his running game is going to be worse, but it's not an insane fall off like they do have Tony Pollard, and I like Spears, who's behind him. And they paid for Calvin Ridley. They have DeAndre Hopkins. Maybe Burks takes another step up. Chigakonkwo, I like as a tight end, but I really like the OC and or the head coach, former OC. I wouldn't be surprised if he plays a little bit better. Maybe this is a tiny bit too high, but I'm doing a little bit of projecting here. I think Richardson obviously has a higher ceiling, but Levis has got more playtime under his shoulders, and I kind of like what's going on in Tennessee. That's kind of my thinking.
Yeah, Levis is really interesting to me. Like you mentioned, he does have some moments. I mean, he's an absolute dog. I just remember him like running through linebackers and stuff at just every game, just doing some crazy stuff. So he definitely has the element in his game. But there are some things that worry me about him. And you mentioned one of them is accuracy issues. There's not a huge precedent of those being improved outside of, there's some outliers. Josh Allen, obviously. You really need like a really good offensive mind to come in and fix that. Maybe Callahan is that guy, but I would push back a little bit because it's not like Levis is a super young player. He's not like a Josh Allen where he came in and you can still kind of refine him a ton. That's another thing that I'm a little bit questioning regarding Levis is how much is he going to improve, because he did spend a lot of time at college, and I think, what is he going to be, 24 or 25 next year already? So he's going to be up there in age a little bit. So has he reached somewhat close to his ceiling already? I guess
24.
24. Okay, so that's something that
He'll be 25.
So that's something I'm a little bit waiting to see. And then his pocket presence. That was another thing that really jumped off the screen for me watching him play. I know the offensive line wasn't great. That obviously, plays a factor. But for example, who I have on my list at number 26, Bryce Young, I thought his pocket presence jumped off the screen a lot because his offensive line wasn't good either, but he was still evading sacks and he would step up in the pocket. That's kind of something I really notice about quarterbacks a lot, is just kind of their feel in the pocket. I feel like Levis didn't have that a ton. So those are just some of the concerns I have with him. But I do, also acknowledge a lot of the moves the Titans made in free agency, and they did surround him fairly well. So I could see a jump. He does have an offensive coach now instead of Vrabel. He does have a lot of new weapons coming in. So he could have a good season, but I just kind of want to be I want to be proven that he can do that instead of having him over some of these guys that I know are going to be solid players. So I definitely see your argument for having Levis a little bit higher, and we'll just have to wait and see on him. But he's going to be fun to watch at least this year and see how he and the Titans can perform.
Yeah, it's funny because I had what you're saying with Levis is kind of what I was saying with like a lot of the other older guys that I had that were higher on the list and everything like that. But I think with Levis, I'm just saying it because I'm a little more confident, just because I kind of like what it is. But again, I do think Young and Richardson have higher potential and could definitely be higher if they are in a good infrastructure as well. I just think Will Levis in year 2 could potentially reach a point where he jumps a little bit higher
Yeah.
than expected. But maybe year 3, 4, 5, 6, he won't really fully reach it, because I think these first 2 years are kind of
He'll
his
just kind
like
of hit the
boom
ceiling. Yeah,
year.
I feel it.
Yeah. So that's kind of my thinking, is that the offense was fixed now. Why can't he just do it now? Because he already showed the stuff last year. Whereas Anthony Richardson's like, he's just getting his first rookie year. So that's kind of thinking. But I think he could go up to like near 20s or something like that, or late teens at his peak, because I think he could be like a more volatile, not Josh Allen, but just using him as an example. Like, he's not obviously built like Josh Allen, but he does a lot of the big crazy stuff that Josh Allen does in terms of these big throws. So maybe he could just be a more volatile Josh Allen, if that's even possible for how much turnovers that happens. But if you understand what I'm saying, that's kind of what I'm thinking there. So that will do it for this part of the list. One guy we didn't mention, I'll mention here because I have him next, and that's Bryce Young at 22. I have Derek Carr at 21, Baker Mayfield at 20, Brock Purdy at 19. We'll get into that one. And then Caleb Williams at 18. And you have Derek Carr at 22, just one spot difference. Deshaun Watson at 21, Geno Smith at 20, Caleb Williams at 19, another one spot difference, and Baker at 18, only two spots. So again, we have three guys here that are the same. But let's start off with the guy you had a little bit lower. And it's not a big difference. Maybe part of it is my bias. I would understand that. I still do have stuff to back up what I say, though, in terms of when I'm talking about Bryce Young. Bryce Young this feels like Trevor Lawrence 2.0. Now, I don't think he has the same ceiling as Trevor Lawrence. I think Trevor Lawrence has a very high ceiling. But I think in terms of his situation, this is basically, it's almost like him losing a season. Like Trevor Lawrence lost a rookie year because it was horrible. And maybe a little worse just because the coach was, doing a bunch of crazy stuff like Urban Meyer. But with Bryce Young, he's already on his third head coach now. His O-line was very poor. Levis's was honestly low-key a little worse. He just kind of chucked it down the field a little bit more because the Panthers offense didn't want to just throw it down the field all the time because they didn't have the receivers that could go down the field. So that's kind of part why. But had a poor line. I think he had the worst receivers, in my opinion, in the NFL. I think that could be debatable, but it doesn't even matter at this point. If maybe one or two teams had a little bit worse, like the Giants had worse or whatever, they're all in the same. It was very, very bad. He was bouncing through different play callers the entire season. Now, they've spent a ton of money on O-line. O-line is much better than it was last year. They drafted 3 different weapons, 2 of which I think will start week 1, in Jatavion Sanders and Xavier Legette. They obviously drafted Brooks as well, who's coming off an injury and will take a little bit of time to come back. Now, I do think he is... I do have him just a little bit above Levis because I think he has a higher ceiling, and that's kind of just what I'm kind of thinking there. I wouldn't be surprised if Levis has a better season, but I think I don't expect the same exact Trevor Lawrence trajectory, but I really think he could be somewhere around this range, and I think this could be him, or just being looked at him as like, hey, this is your first real rookie year. And I think he could end up finishing off pretty well because specifically the offense is so much better, and especially the coaching. Dave Canales, I think very highly of. He was in Seattle when Geno had his big resurgence. He was in Tampa Bay last year. Baker Mayfield had his big resurgence. And I think Bryce Young is more talented than both of those guys. And I think he could get in there and Bryce could just show so much more progression his second year, but it still might take another year for that to happen because team-wise, they're still not going to be amazing. The defense, they had to give up a lot of the defensive players to help the offense, but that was the main goal. The new GM came in, you got all these good defensive players, and it was a very good defense, but how many wins did it get you? Like 2. So get rid of him, get the new offense in. That needs to be priority number 1, needs to be make sure Bryce Young works, because you're not fixing the trade. The other GM already is a freaking idiot. He already did that. You can't change the past. The Bears absolutely won that trade. But what you can do is save yourself and make sure the guy you traded all that stuff for does not completely blow up in your face. And then it's very possible that that could happen, but it's also very possible that it doesn't. And I think they're doing a good job in making sure it doesn't happen. I have him just a little bit higher because I do think I did see a lot of the good stuff in Bryce Young, and I do believe that he could be a good quarterback. Sorry for my long ramble on with my favorite quarterback, Bryce Young, but I don't think I let you talk about him a little bit. But what's your rebuttal to that?
I think a lot of the things you said is true as far as the situation goes and how they've surrounded him this offseason. I think you remember kind of my stance on Young during last year's draft. I just don't like historic outliers in terms of banking on them to be successful. And anytime you draft a guy that's his size, which he's the smallest quarterback in the league, and he's not super athletic, he's not like Kyler Murray, who's the second smallest quarterback, but is a lot more agile, has a lot quicker feet to move around, and doesn't have a good arm. He's not going to be making off-platform 40-yard throws like Kyler Murray or some of those other quarterbacks that are undersized can. And so when you have a quarterback like that, I just don't think I would trade all that capital and use the first overall pick to do so. That was kind of my stance last year. And, like you said, it's in the past. It doesn't really matter now. But I just think Young as a player, he does have some positives. I've compared him on my channel a few times to Tua, another Alabama quarterback, a guy that is an anticipatory thrower. He's accurate over the middle of the field, mainly. He's not going to be a guy that makes a ton of, outside the number deep throws. That's not really his game. He doesn't really have the skill set to do that. And that's kind of what you got to build around. And that's kind of what the Panthers did. They got some guys that can be good yards after the catch players. I think Deontay Johnson's a guy that can do that. He can also go over the middle of the field. They got a new offensive mind to help build a system that caters to his skill set. But I think Bryce could be a souped up version of kind of like a Tua, where he can move around a little bit better, because although he doesn't have, I said he didn't have great movement, but I still think he has good pocket presence. He can extend plays better than some of those like Jared Goffs and the Cousins and the Tuas, the other pocket passers that can't move around well. Bryce moves better than all those guys. I just kind of mean in terms of like Jalen Hurts or like Lamar Jackson. Like he's not like an elite athlete like those guys. So when I take all that into consideration, I still think we have him fairly close. 26-22 is not that, that's not that far off. I just don't know. I personally just can't see Bryce ever becoming like an elite player. That's just kind of my thing. I can't see him becoming that elite player. Maybe he proves me wrong and he becomes like a super mobile Drew Brees. But anytime you have these historic outliers, history says just to go the other way with it, and that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm just kind of fading everything Bryce Young. But I'm kind of rooting for him because he seems like a good guy. I hope he does do well this year. It's always good to have a lot of good quarterbacks in both conferences, because right now, really all the good quarterbacks are in the AFC. So I'm rooting for him to do well. I don't particularly buy it, but I think he will definitely be improved this year just because of the situation around him. As you mentioned, you laid it all out. He'll definitely be better this year. It just, we'll see how much and how much better he can continue to get after this year.
Yeah, I think, at least my opinion of his peak is like the very beginning of the non-elite club. Because I think I agree with that. I think you could look at elite quarterbacks. I think his ceiling is like, yeah, but you're not fully in that club, but you're still really good. We could win a Super Bowl with you. It's possible. But I would be lying if I didn't say it's, a little bit far-fetched and a long road to go. I just think it is possible because I do believe in his talent. And like you said, obviously his mobility, the way he can make different plays. But I will say if he doesn't work with all the stuff that's around him, it might be a like kind of end of just like, hey, if they're not Lamar Jackson or Kyler as an athlete, you can't draft him this high. I would understand that, or if they don't have Tua's arm or something like that. But that's kind of we can leave Bryce Young off there. Derek Carr, 21. You have him at 22. Don't need to go crazy in depth, but wasn't as... I had him pretty low going into... I was pretty spot on with the Saints. That was the one team I was totally spot on with. Totally mid. Didn't love the Derek Carr signing. A little too much money, but he's okay. And he was a little bit better than I thought. It was definitely a much better comeback than the end of the Las Vegas era.
Middle of the road quarterback at this point. I mean, he's awful. Probably the worst red zone quarterback in the league. He's not very consistent, up and down. I mean, we don't need to spend too much time on him. I mean, he's just he's in this range, 21, 22. You know, that's where he is.
Yeah, like he's fine. And then we have Baker Mayfield, 20, and you have him at 18.
Yeah.
I was a little hesitant to put him this high, but I'll reward his season that he did have, but it always seems to be some kind of cycle of like he ends up playing pretty good, and then it starts to slowly fall apart, and then he's cast out, and then a team finds him, and then he's has a little bit of resurgence, and then he does good, and then we go back down. So I'm a little scared because he literally hasn't had good back-to-back seasons ever in his career, which is really weird. But I think in terms of his regular season, it was not honestly like insane. It was like okay. I say insane. It wasn't necessarily like where he's rated right now. I think he's rated here because of his playoffs, because he had 2 good playoff games, which credit to him. They were good. I especially because the last one, the loss wasn't really his fault against the Lions. Like that wasn't really because of him. But I do think he did pretty well without a real run game as well, which his whole career he's been much better in play action, which if you have a good running game that helps play action.
For sure.
This year that wasn't the case, and he was better without play action. So I think, and that's the first time that's ever happened. So credit to him. But I do think, there could be having good guys that are healthy around him is still important. And I think there could be a downgrade just because it is probably a downgrade in play caller, and that could affect him. But I still want to give him credit. His contract wasn't even that bad either. So I have him at 20. You have him at 18. What's your thoughts on Baker?
Yeah, I thought he had a resurgence last year. Really liked his play. I still think he's just an average, solid quarterback, and that's kind of where I have him listed. I think his supporting cast definitely did help, just having a little bit more, guys that can make some plays happen naturally, like Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, even Rashad White out of the backfield, just throwing some screens to him, letting him make things happen. I think Baker is, it kind of is. He's shown what he is. He's not gonna be a consistent player week in, week out, and that's probably why he's gonna be a mid-tier quarterback for his entire career. But I think when he's on and he's playing hyped up football like Baker does sometimes, he can be a top 12 guy sometimes. If it's on the right day. But then there's other times where if he's came out of bed a little bit in the wrong mood or something, hey, he could come out and throw you 3 interceptions and be a bottom 5 quarterback. And that's kind of why he's at 18 for me, is because there's just such a wide variance of what Baker Mayfield you're going to get. But I just kind of like Baker personally. I've always kind of liked just his personality. So maybe that's why I have him a little bit higher. But Baker at 18, 20, it's relatively the same. I kind of like that range for him.
Sorry for the quick intermission there. Had to switch setups real quick, but it's fine. Who cares?
Yeah.
Baker Mayfield is what we were going on about, and don't think we need to say too much about him anymore. But let's go ahead and get into another guy that we both have on the current list in front of you, and that's Caleb Williams, the rookie, obviously, out of USC, number 1 overall pick to the Chicago Bears. Mine is at 18, yours is at 19, but it's around the same range. I think he could be even higher or lower, either one. He's, like we said, volatile, but insanely talented. His receiving core is going to be great. The O-line for the previous Bears team, I think, has improved. For this one, it's not crazy, but it's doable for sure. He's going to have some ups and downs, but I think, like we saw with Will Levis, I think it'll just be more ups and less downs, and I think he's just going to be better, straight up. But I have some relatively high expectations. I'd be interested if other people made lists to see where they put him.
Yeah.
I feel like this is a good spot. Obviously, both of us agree. But what are your thoughts on Caleb Williams?
Yeah, he's interesting because I don't know how exactly he's going to translate right away to the NFL, but his infrastructure, I think, is really, really good. I guess we'll see about his offensive coordinator. Don't really love the Bears coaching staff, but in terms of his weaponry and just what he has on offense, it's a lot of fireworks. And I think Caleb is still just going to be able to make some insane plays. He just, even we saw 3 years of college, just ability to make off script plays. I think that's going to translate really nicely. But in terms of play to play basis, in terms of being like an on script player and just hitting the right reads, throwing to the right people on time, accurate, it's to be seen about that because that was something out of USC that I had a couple of questions with if he would be able to do that consistently in the NFL or if that was just because he thought he had to do too much at USC to kind of bring that team to be competitive. So we'll see how that all plays out. But I still think just due to not really knowing exactly how a player's going to play in his first ever NFL down game season, this is a good spot to have somebody that's as talented as him, but we have not even seen a snap of him in a Bears uniform yet.
Yeah, so that's kind of where we're at least projecting of him. And then we each have one guy that we both have not major discrepancies on, maybe a little bit, because I think couple like 7-ish spot difference for two guys when you're in the top 20. That's a pretty big difference. So I'll let you start off first. Yours is Geno Smith, and you have him at 20. Mine's a little higher. I'll say later when we get to it. But what's your thinking on Geno Smith?
I think Geno, he's a fascinating story. Another guy that's really easy to root for. I think 2 years ago I had him a lot higher than 20. I think last year he wasn't as good. He got kind of banged up, and then just his production was a little bit down. And Seattle wasn't as good as a team. I mean, they made the playoffs 2 years ago. So I just think he's kind of showing what he is almost. I think he's just around again, a below average to mid quarterback. He's got times where he can make some really impressive throws, but there's also some times where it seems like, Geno, what are you doing? Or he doesn't really show up for a game. And I just remember watching him against some other, top end quarterbacks or top end teams, and it never really felt like the Seahawks had a chance to win that game. Like against the 49ers, for example, or maybe like the Rams, just seeing him against Stafford and some of the other NFC top quarterbacks. It just doesn't feel like you really have a chance to win those games because I just don't think Geno is, that caliber of quarterback. But I think, in the 2017 range, I could be talked into having him a little bit higher. I just kind of like some of the guys I had, ahead of him just a little bit more. But yeah, that's kind of why I have him at 20.
Now it's interesting because I'll reveal it now. I have him at 17, but it would have sounded like you would have had him much lower because the way I'm going to be talking about him now. Because I had him higher. I had him at 17, but I did drop him from last year's rankings.
Yeah,
that I had him
me too.
much higher, obviously. But I think around this range, I still think is like average. I think below average you could look because I think a lot of the honorable mention guys are still guys that like people potentially think about at quarterback. So I think an average quarterback could still be around this range for sure. I think there's a big variance.
Yeah.
But I think obviously the stats did not improve from last year, but I didn't really fully feel a giant fall off. I just had to put him lower just because I was like, well, I just think at this moment these guys are better, and because he is older.
Yep.
And he's not getting any better at all. But he still had the same amount of just like big time throws, and turnover worthy plays were less. He actually had more drops this year, so maybe his stats were potentially affected by that, which I think plays a big role because they do a lot of deep balls. He's the second year in a row he was one of the best deep ball throwers in the NFL because he was, I think, rated as the best last year, and this past year he was still top 3 or 5. I can't remember exactly which one, but I think essentially some of the drops maybe fell off a few of the stats, And if he's going deep, that obviously changes the game a ton and maybe flips some of the wins to losses. Who knows? But I think the second year, it was almost like he showed a little more consistency, but less like pop. Whereas last year it was more pop, but less consistency. This year was almost a little more consistency, just not as much like big games. But again, one of the best deep ball throwers. His passer rating, we said, was lower because of completion percentage, which was due to drops. His adjusted completion percentage was 7th, where his general completion percentage was 21st. So that's a giant jump, which adjusted completion percentage takes into account like dead ball plays, just like throwing into the ground or whatever, and drops. So pretty big discrepancy there. And I like the weapons for next year. The O-line is what concerns me, especially with his age, because it's still a little bit iffy. But that's what it's been the past 2 years. It's been kind of iffy, and he's still done what he's done. So I think, if he's on other teams, I think maybe we'll look at him a little bit higher. But he's really impressed me for the past 2 years here. But I would be lying if I said his future was super bright. I do think next year, I wouldn't be surprised if Seattle went ahead and got a quarterback. But I do think Geno still has this year of starting and maybe one more, at least with Seattle, because he is older and all that stuff. But I was honestly kind of impressed with how I just kind of looked at the different stuff with Geno. Do you have any? If you don't, do you have anything to say for that at all? Or if
I would
not,
just
I can
say,
move on to the next one.
yeah, I think this could be. It just depends on how this season goes. Probably how long he would stay in Seattle, because they have a new regime kind of now with Mike McDonald coming in. So if Seattle is good, a potential wild card team again, maybe he gets another year. But yeah, I think he could be on a short leash. Maybe Sam Howell gets some time. If things are not going well.
Yeah, possible. Or he gets hurt, which he has been.
Yeah.
Then we have Brock Purdy. I have him at 19. I won't reveal where you have him. You have him a little higher. Not crazy, but a solid amount.
Yeah.
And if you've been listening or following to any of my stuff, this shouldn't shock you, but it might a little bit. And that's, I went through a lot of the players above him, and maybe you could even look at the guys below him, but I'm giving him respect, putting him at 19, by the way, just a little bit. That's how, what I genuinely think of Purdy could be even lower, like a tad bit. But some lists I looked at had him a little lower, some had him a little higher. It's a big discrepancy.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely on the lower side. And I know it's low. I can't put him above the guys that are above him. And I know there's going to be so many just general stats. They're going to be so much better. But I think this is kind of one of the guys where I'm going to just look at it objectively and be like, okay, this is why he's here. He is in the absolute best situation for a quarterback, like bar none. He is, my mic almost fell over. That's how crazy it is. He is in the best situation for a quarterback, for sure. He's, obviously not bad. He's not a bad quarterback. He's a pretty solid quarterback, I would say. But he has the best play caller in the NFL. He has the best receiving core and weapons. He has the best running game. He, has a good O-line. It's not crazy, but I do think they make the most out of Trent Williams in terms of being able to use the play calling effectively to just go to his side all the time. He has the lowest drop rate for starting quarterbacks. His yards per attempt is a full yard higher than his average depth of target. The only other guy to have anything close to that is Jake Browning, which, as we noted before, that's meaning that he's throwing the ball, he's gaining more yards on average than he is per attempt than he is throwing the ball in terms of how far he's throwing it. That is a clear sign of throwing it shorter to where the weapons make most of the plays. And that is, having your average depth of target be shorter than your yards per attempt is very rare. That hardly, or the other way around, hardly ever happens. It does happen on occasion for, quarterbacks that only play a few snaps, but quarterbacks that play a whole season, that doesn't happen all the time unless you're consistently not really throwing it down the field and your other guys are just drastically making plays for you, which is what's happening. He's obviously had playoff success as a team. Like, I cannot deny that. He literally went to a Super Bowl. But his play, if you compare this past regular season to 2022 regular season, it was better, for sure. But if you compare both regular seasons to both playoffs, there's a clear downtick, like, for sure. And I think there's a downtick in his play when there's not a downtick in everyone else's play. And I think that does show a ton. And, even if in both NFC playoff games that he played, which was Green Bay and Detroit, both of the defenses were below average defenses. They weren't like these crazy defenses that he had played. And I think this past year was good to have a full season, but he's very limited in terms of his just what he is as a quarterback. He's in the best situation. I cannot express that enough. And he doesn't even dominate. Like, Purdy is both the 49ers' biggest weakness and strength as a team, because he is the worst just starting player on their offense, but he's been like the best quarterback they've had when they've been in this winning mode. But I still think this is around where it is. Like, when you look, obviously the worst in terms of receivers, tight ends, halfbacks, O-linemen, I think his low contract value and ability to just take advantage of play action is ideal for what the offense wants. But I think if I'm comparing him to a guy like Caleb Williams right now, I think Caleb Williams right now is more talented and a better quarterback right now than Purdy, because Caleb Williams is going to elevate other guys even right now in this moment, even if it's more volatile. He's going to go out there and potentially win us games, even if he does have a potential turnover or two, which Purdy is not some like, I take care of the quarterback, I take care of the ball all the time. That's not the case. He does not take care of the ball all the time. So he's not a crazy turnover monster, but he is not just like some guy who takes care of the ball a crazy amount. So I think people are a little shrouded in his success that he's had, and I just think so much of it is attributed to the situation because we've literally seen it before. And I think, could Purdy make another Super Bowl? Yeah, for sure. The roster is insane, and he's a low contract. But I think it's just going to be a showing of this is the difference that he makes compared to all the guys above him in terms of, hey, go make us a play. Go get us a play. Because the playoff run, he was not amazing in the two games, and he was okay in the Super Bowl. Like, he was not bad at all, and I thought he would be bad. He was not bad, but he didn't go win them the game. He just didn't do it. So that's why I'm so much lower on Purdy. I still have him in the top 20. He did go to Super Bowl, but I don't think, we've seen quarterbacks make the Super Bowl. We don't automatically put them super high. I think you just have to look at it through a vacuum, and I think a lot of the quarterbacks above him, if they had a similar situation, they would be winning MVP. Not really being in the top, 5 for MVP. They'd be winning it. So that's kind of my opinions on Purdy for the long preamble that I went on. What is your response to that?
The good old Brock Purdy debate. So I was a little bit more on your side. I would say after his probably like halfway through last season. But I've sat on the Purdy discussion a little bit, and I've came around on him a little bit. The things that I push back on is, you did mention he is the best quarterback that the 49ers have had during this win streak. Jimmy G, Trey Lance. I do think if Trey Lance was having the same success that Brock Purdy was having, I think it would be viewed entirely differently. I think just because of where Purdy was drafted, I'm not saying that's like your reasoning. I'm saying kind of the general consensus. I think that does play a factor into how he's kind of viewed by people that view him negatively. And while I do think that his numbers definitely don't, tell the whole story, I do think even just his eye test, I do think at times he can make some things happen. And we'll talk about some other quarterbacks later, like Kirk Cousins or Tua, who do not do well against good teams. Purdy his numbers are actually fairly good against some of the top NFC teams that he played, like the Cowboys last year. Even like I guess in the regular season, the playoffs. I mean, his numbers weren't super good, but I would even say about those playoff games, when it came to Purdy make a play, get a first down in this game, he had a few scrambles in both of those games to kind of ice the game,
Yeah.
and that kind of boosted him a little bit for me because up until then it was like, okay, he's just a system quarterback, he can't make any plays. No, I think he can do some things out of structure where some of the other quarterbacks that people like to compare him to, like Tua or a Kirk Cousins or some of those guys can't make some plays like Purdy can. So I think Purdy, I do think he benefits a lot, obviously, from having everything you mentioned. Obviously, he does, no doubt. But I do think, I don't really know if you can, like, I don't know how much you can use that against him almost. Like, it's not his fault that he gets to use those players or have that coach. And he's still leading the 49ers to having a top 3 offense. He's still leading them to the Super Bowl. I still think he deserves some credit for that.
Yeah, no, it's not his. Obviously, I do think though, like, I think you can tell when if a player has very good stuff around him, like they can still be good. Like Peyton Manning with Marvin Harrison, or Tom Brady with Randy Moss, Mahomes with Hill. Like obviously, players in infrastructure can be great around them and they can still be good. I think it's just I just think it's underestimated how amazing the infrastructure is, because there's not a single thing that's missing. Like play caller, probably the best. Now,
the thing I would ask you,
as head coach, he's had issues for sure. I think play caller though, he is the best. Pro Bowls and all pro caliber players all over at tight end and receiver, the best running back in the NFL. Yet he still has had like down stuff, and I guess I do want to give him credit. He had that run. He's had runs that have helped them for sure. But I think just going off of your Trey Lance point, and then you can go on. I think if it was where Trey Lance was here, I think it would be viewed a little higher, because I think he would show more plays of like, yeah, I'm him. Like I can do this, in terms of not running for a first down, running for a touchdown from the same yard point, or not throwing a 2-yard flat to Debo, but a 20-yard between the numbers slant to Debo to take. Like that's kind of what I'm thinking, because I just watching the games, the Super Bowl impressed me more than I initially thought of him.
Yeah.
I just really, really think he's in such an amazing situation. I think a lot of other guys would succeed. And I think he should be dominating if he was really as high.
What do you consider like dominating though? Because I mean, he had over 30 touchdowns.
MVP.
Well, was he not in the MVP discussion to the final like 2 or 3 weeks until the Ravens game? I mean, he was the Vegas favorite.
There was a point where he was, and I remember making a video of like he should not be, because I'm watching.
I didn't think he should be an MVP.
Like, this is not it.
No, I didn't think he should be MVP.
It totally fell off.
Well, because that Ravens game when he had 3.
The Ravens, but even after that, there was another game or two where it also kind of fell off. But I think even just looking at the playoffs, like I do think there are other quarterbacks that fall off in the playoffs when we're like, dude, are you serious? But their infrastructure is just not as elite as the Niners are, to where I'm like, dude, if Kirk Cousins was here, I could see like a similar scenario where like Stafford won a Super Bowl, like Kirk Cousins won a Super Bowl. I'm not lying. I could totally have seen that happening. And that's just because I think very highly as well of Kirk Cousins as a thrower of the football. And I think objectively he's gotten a bad rap, but I think the stats speak for themselves for years on end. And I just think he's a better processor and thrower of the football. But I think Purdy is like the perfect talking point and just median of like, okay, can this guy get you to the promised land if you've got all this correct stuff? Because I think it's very hard to get there, and that's why I think people, should give a ton of props to Mahomes for what he's done. This was not supposed to be the year they won, but I don't know. We can have obviously very. Well,
I'll just do.
You can close it out.
Yeah, quick couple points. Yeah, we spent a lot of time on Purdy, so I'll just do quick couple of points. So. Yeah, Trey Lance, like, I see what you mean, like, the situation, everything. But I do think Trey Lance is kind of a a piece of evidence that not every quarterback can step in and just be a great player, because Trey Lance wasn't good for the 49ers. Maybe he's just not a good player, but I think that's one point. And then the second point is, what's the difference between like Purdy and Tua then? Because Purdy had better numbers than Tua. He's got more playoff success than Tua. Tua has a good infrastructure, but Purdy does more off script than Tua does. So I don't think Purdy.
Tua's a better Purdy.
I view it the opposite. I think Purdy is a better version of Tua, but I do think they're pretty similar in that lens. What you're kind of saying though. So that was just my second thing is basing.
I think I think Purdy is obviously more mobile, but I think Tua is just a much more advanced thrower in terms of his highs are higher. Now he has some pretty disgusting lows, but his highs are higher.
I could see that.
I would say though, if you're saying give me a guy, they both got injured, but Tua, it wasn't too long ago where he had all those issues with concussions. Yeah. So if I'm saying give me a quarterback in terms of what's safer, like, yeah, sure, I might pick another one. I'm just saying if they are I viewed it as if these guys are on this team right now, like, what is the case? And if you're the Dolphins, the Niners are in the NFC and they had the number 1 seed to where they can play in San Francisco the whole year or the whole playoffs,
Yeah.
To where if you're like Tua and you don't want to go to Kansas City where it's whatever below freezing or whatever that game was.
That's true about Purdy too. Is he's not super good in inclement weather either, because he's a smaller guy, smaller hands, kind of. I mean, similarly to Tua, they're just very similar because they both kind of have the same little struggles too, just
in the same cold
and stuff. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So, but yeah, let's move on from Purdy. We've done enough about him.
That's why I'm lower. But let's get to the next part of the list, and we got a lot of stuff here. You're gonna have to take it in. It's a good amount of quarterbacks, but let's start with the first half. So we'll do 17 through 14. Mine is Geno Smith at 17, Kyler Murray at 16, Kirk Cousins 15, Tua 14. You have Kyler Murray 17, Trevor Lawrence 16, Kirk 15, Tua 14. As you can see, two of them are exactly the same. One of them is only one spot off. We already talked about Geno. Let's get into Kyler Murray quickly. We don't have to do a ton just because I think we kind of have a relatively similar opinion. I do think he has room to go up for sure.
Yeah, with Marv.
But I think for right now he's here. I think after coming back, he was fine. He did have good moments near the end of the season. Obviously, you think of the Raiders play and the Raiders game. That was pretty crazy. I do believe in the talent. I think he's proved it before. I don't love his situation, obviously. I think it might be he's probably the reason the Cardinals win more games than people expect, just because I do think he is talented.
Yeah.
But I think he just kind of has to go here based on what I think he might end up producing next year.
Yeah, pretty much agreed on all points. Very, very talented, great mobility, strong arm. A little bit limited, can't really throw over the middle of the field because of his size, and it's just not really a huge skill set for him. But I do think getting back, like almost like a D-Hop kind of 2.0 with getting Marvin, because Kyler was really, really good when he had D-Hop to just kind of lob some deep throws down the field to him, do some off script stuff, and then throw it to him. I could see something similar with Marv happening there. But I think this is a good spot for him just because we really haven't seen Kyler really play a full season in like two or 3 years now. So
it's been a minute.
Yeah.
I mean, the last one he did, he had that stretch where he didn't play the full season, but he had that stretch where he was like an MVP candidate.
Yeah.
And was playing great. Went to the playoffs. Obviously, it went terribly, but the coach probably wasn't amazing. So, yeah, I think this is kind of where he is. And then we have the same exact 15-14, and that's Kirk and Tua.
Yeah.
And, I was kind of worried about where you would have both of these guys. I didn't know if you'd have Kirk too low or Tua too high.
Yeah,
but we have them the exact same. I was tempted to put Kirk a little higher. I do view him pretty high, but I'm just worried about his injury. Pre-injury, though, he was playing well. He had 18 touchdowns in 8 games.
Maybe his best season.
Maybe
his best season.
But he was on pace for a pretty phenomenal season, and they were still losing games. I think they would have turned it around, and I for sure think they would have made the playoffs, which is an interesting thing to think about because that knocks out one of the teams, which could be the Packers.
Yeah, they went on a crazy
run. They could have got knocked out, and they literally beat the
Cowboys.
Cowboys, so maybe that's a world that we lived in. But I think they were on pace to make it. Kirk was playing great and still had. I mean, remember that his running game was horrible. Alexander Madison was the worst starting running back in the
Yeah.
NFL. I remember that one game where they lost because Justin Jefferson dove at the goal line and fumbled.
Mm.
I don't know if you remember that game,
Yeah.
but they had that thing there. But his completion percentage was 69%. Nice. Adjusted completion percentage was the highest because the drop percentage was in the top 5. So he literally had drops anyways, had young players there as well. He had the same amount of drops in 8 games as Tua did in 17 games. And Kirk has way more drops than Purdy does in 19 games. So just a little bit of perspective there. Again, he's not higher because of his injury, but I'm honestly optimistic for his 2024 with the Falcons. I really think they have a great. I just think they have great weapons there. I think their quarterback play was probably the worst in the NFL,
Yep.
but they still have a good O-line, good weapons. Like, I think they're a shoe-in for the playoffs, if I'm being honest. I think they could be the Bucs of last year. I just, even if they did completely botch the draft to help him at all, I think this is around where he is. He got paid, obviously, but I don't think it's that bad, to be honest, for what other quarterbacks are going to start getting, or if you compare it to other quarterbacks' deals.
Yeah.
Only thing, like I said, is the injury that concerns me. What say you with Kirk?
Pretty much, I agree once again. I mean, we have him at 15. I think we kind of view him the exact same. If he didn't suffer that Achilles injury and he finished that year on that pace, I
Might
might
be
have
higher,
he
maybe.
might have been like top 12 for me, if I'm being
Potentially.
honest. If he continued on that pace, but at his age, coming off of that severe injury, I just want to see him first and see if he's still that player that he was last year, or if he will have some drop off. But it's going to definitely be fun to watch him this year in Atlanta. But I think 15 is a good spot for him.
Yeah, and then you can. I have Tua notes, but you can start off with Tua while you have him at 14.
Yeah, I could go on a long-winded thing about Tua, but it's just pretty simple for me. I mean, my kind of thing with Tua, how high I was on him for like years when he was at Alabama, and then early on with the Dolphins, and then kind of after this year, I've kind of just had enough of just kind of him and hoping that he becomes more than he has the capability to become. So I think Tua at this point, this is just where he belongs, just in this kind of middle tier range. I think going back to Bryce Young a little bit, he's just a limited player. He doesn't have good athleticism. He doesn't have good arm strength. He's not super tall. He's like 6 feet, so he's still relatively small. And when you play good teams, you need him to like step up and be clutch. When you have to play in the cold, and in the AFC, you got to go to Buffalo, you got to go to Kansas City, you got to go to Cincinnati, you got to go to Baltimore. So you're going to be playing in the cold in the playoffs. He can't do it.
Unless you win the AFC, which is extremely hard.
Yes,
obviously.
only one team can do it. So there's just he's got a lot of shortcomings, and I think obviously it's masked by having Mike McDaniel and his offensive scheme, having Tyreek Hill, having Jalen Waddle. It helps him out a lot. And obviously, any quarterback, I used to say this a lot in defending Tua, you have to have good players around you to be good if you're a player, unless you're, I guess, Patrick Mahomes. But, even him, he still has, Andy Reid. So you still got to have pieces around you to be, a good player and be productive. So I don't knock him a ton for that. But when you have all those pieces around you and you have to, sometimes do something to bring your team above them, like kind of just carry them for a play or for a drive. Tua is just incapable of doing that because of his limitations, and you can't fix his limitations. He can't grow a stronger arm. He can't grow several inches. He can't become faster. So he's just got to, I guess, just learn how to be better under pressure and just kind of hone down on his skills. Maybe become a better, consistent decision maker. But I think he kind of is what he is at this point. And I wouldn't pay him $50 million. I know you wouldn't pay him $50 million. I know like 90% of people wouldn't pay him $50 million. Only like 10% of like Tua stands.
And those 10% might be in the front office.
yeah, the front office of the Dolphins, and then all the Tua stands, his family, some of our extremist fans, those are people that would pay him that type of money. I just don't think you can pay him that when you've seen that he can't, carry a team or rise to the occasion in important moments. I think kind of the end for me was just this final stretch this season was having our best year in like 20 years. And the Bills were 6-6. I think we were like 9-3 or something like that. And all we had to do was just take care of business. And then he blew the Titans game. He couldn't pick up a first down in 2 straight drives. I mean, our defense obviously wasn't good. We talked about Will Levis. But all he had to do was pick up 1 first down in 2 drives to not give the ball back to the Titans, and he couldn't do it. And you go to the couple weeks later against the Baltimore Ravens for the number 1 seed, and he came up short again. Our defense, once again, didn't play well, but hey, Tua, you're supposed to, be able to have these shootouts with other elite quarterbacks, and he didn't show up. And then the following week, the very next week against the Buffalo Bills, the Bills on a huge game winning streak coming into town in Miami. So there's no weather excuse. There's no on the road excuse. Tyreek Hill's playing. Everybody, there was really no excuses for that game. And he put up 14 points. It's just not gonna get it done. And they choked the division lead. They just once again stumbled in the playoffs, had another December meltdown. Went to Kansas City, and before the game even started, because of the temperature, like negative 20 degrees or something, everybody knew the Dolphins had no chance in that game, and it was because of Tua, because he can't play in the cold weather, and you just knew he was not going to be able to pass the ball, move the ball. So yeah, I just think at this point he's a slightly above average, below average quarterback or middle tier quarterback, and yeah, he's got some good assets, but I think those assets you can find in 7th round quarterbacks, aka Brock Purdy. So that's kind of what I think about Tua.
He's one of the weirdest quarterbacks to analyze.
Yeah.
Like just really weird, because he graded as the best pure passer in 2023, which is very weird. He finally had a fully healthy year. It's weird, but it's also like, yeah, I could see that. The only thing is, he only rivals the Niners and the Lions for like the best stuff around him. Now, you were talking about good quarterbacks earlier. I think there's a limit of like having good stuff around you, like a good receiver or a good offensive line.
Yeah.
But then there's like the best running back, the best group of receivers, the top 3 tight end, the best like that kind of stuff, the best play caller. And I do think the Niners are number 1, and you could say the Dolphins are 2. You know. Mike McDaniel is a great play caller, top 5 probably. Has the top graded, at least in terms of last year, top 2 in terms of receiving game and the running game, which is full of speed, obviously. For quarterbacks who actually graded as like average or above average in terms of PFF's just grading for quarterbacks, he had the second highest turnover worthy play percentage behind Trevor Lawrence, who was hurt a majority of the year.
Yep.
His yards per attempt was higher than his average depth of target, which we talked about with Brock, but it's not the same extent. It's just slightly, where Brock's is way higher. A yard is very high in terms of the difference between those two. His drop percentage was just by quarterbacks only rivaled to Brock Purdy, meaning Purdy was the only one that had a lower drop percentage than Tua. He makes some great deep or tight window throws that I think Purdy can't make, but then he just has some like of the stupidest throws I've ever seen in my life. Like I remember, I can't remember, was it the Jaguars?
Yeah,
game,
it was
like
his
a year or two ago.
It was his second year.
I was like, what the hell was that? Like, it was just like, what? But then you look and it's like, yeah, it's like, I mean, he makes this throw. He had these stats. He grades like this. It's just it's so weird.
Yeah.
But his passer rating when he was under pressure is 57. He has the most turnover worthy plays in a clean pocket. Like when it's just a clean pocket, he has the most turnover worthy plays last year. So, like, I want to give him his respect, but I do, his injury history, like we were talking about, if you were to pick a quarterback to go forward with or pay, I would be so scared to do Tua. And,
Yep.
all the stuff around him is, great. And they still have major issues. I think it's also kind of like, I do think him as a pure passer is better and has, been better. And is taking advantage fully of the stuff that's around him. But at the same time, it's like he makes so many just like bad throws and he's can't really get out of the pocket in terms of being like, if he has a ton of pressure. So he's got to have a great O-line. And I mean, we haven't had any playoff success.
Yep.
Now, granted, it's only been 1 year because he did get injured, which maybe if he played, they could have beat the Bills. I mean, Skylar Thompson,
Yeah.
didn't he damn near beat the Bills
Yeah.
in that game? Maybe,
Yep.
but that's a maybe. We have no clue. We have no idea.
Yeah.
Or I know he wasn't fully healthy or the team wasn't healthy and it was in horrible weather this past year, but
That was his
even
fault
then,
that they were in that game, though.
yeah, could they have beat the Chiefs? I don't really think so, to be honest. I mean, they just won the Super Bowl. They stepped it up in the playoffs. Like,
No, but if they
I
would have
think-
gotten like the 3 seed and played, who was the 6 seed? The Browns. I think it was the Browns were the 6 seed, or who was the 6 seed?
I can't remember.
I don't know, but whatever. They
can't remember.
had a better
A
chance to win
different team.
a home
A
playoff
different
game,
team.
though. They
Yeah.
could have won a home playoff game versus going in the cold.
Potentially, yeah. So it's just like, I don't know. There's so many stats of him that I just mentioned that are just like so bad.
Yeah.
Or just like, why would you trust this guy? But then it's also like, well, look what he did. And it's like, yeah, I can't really deny it. He's had this production and everything. So I'd be so scared, like you said, to pay him. I would not do it.
Yep.
I just wouldn't. I think I want to see a good playoff game. Just
For
give
sure.
it,
Yeah.
I got to see it, which it could happen this year for sure. But, they were, to his credit, not to his credit, but more so like just, it's not all his fault, obviously, because the Dolphins defense did have a bunch of injuries at the end of the year, especially the pass rushers, which kind of ended it. But I think having to be like, hey, Tua, you got to host a playoff game to have a good chance. It's kind of like,
It's a big disadvantage to have as a team.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of that. But yeah, just such very weird quarterback to have. And I know both of us had him higher last year because we expected a little more. But
Because he was good until he got injured, and I thought he was.
yeah,
I mean, I guess his numbers. He led the league in passing yards, so I mean, his numbers did improve a little bit. But I think the biggest thing I was looking for was, could he step up in the big moments and win a playoff game? And he was unable to do it. So he kind of,
in my opinion, like Purdy and Tua are like not the definition, but the slight poster child of like, don't just go based on stats.
Yep, that's for sure.
Like if that was the case, they would be
Yep.
a top 5 quarterback.
Yep.
Yep,
100%.
And that's kind of my thinking for 13, to be honest. And I think 13, 12, and 11, some people might be shocked. But I do have reasoning for all of them. Now this episode is going to be super long, but I don't give a crap. We'll just go through and do it because I think it's fine to just go through and give our reasoning for everything. Because we put a lot of time into it. And I'll start off with Dak because I think I had a really tough time placing Dak because I really wanted to put him, higher, but objectively, I gotta put him here when I just look at the guys ahead. Looking at his 2023 season, he was third in yards, first in touchdowns, only had 9 interceptions. In terms of the next 7 touchdown leaders, they all had more interceptions than him. For the amount of touchdowns he threw, he didn't really throw a ton of interceptions. He had the second best passer rating under pressure behind Lamar Jackson, who, he's Lamar Jackson. And he was the best rated passer when not using play action, which play action obviously helps a lot of QBs. He was the best when not using play action, meaning just purely throwing the ball. He has a good line in defense, obviously, and CD Lamb is obviously amazing, but it's kind of like, it's not like a 49ers or Dolphins thing. Like, the play caller isn't insane. The O-line is good, but it's not crazy. Or the weapons are, good, but it's kind of like one main guy, and I think based on his 2023 regular season, you could make an argument for him being like top 7 or 5 if it wasn't for one thing, and that's the playoffs. The 2023 Cowboys versus Packers game was one of the most shocking results from a playoff game in recent memory, in
Yeah.
my opinion.
Yep.
Green Bay had an average to slightly below average defense. The Cowboys had, I mean, they were the second seed. I know a lot of people hate on the Cowboys all the time, but they were the second seed. Dak had his best regular season ever. And, Dak ended that game with a lot of yards, but it was mostly in garbage time. And it was one of the most shocking things of how much they just got owned. And it just exploded right from the beginning. Literally right from the beginning. And just for him as a player, he has a 2-5 playoff record. One of those wins, the most recent one, which was I believe last year, where it was, Tom Brady's on his last leg, and they won that game. And he was good. But the defense was also poor. The Buccaneers was. His total PFF offensive grade for his playoff career equals a slightly better 2023 Aiden O'Connell or 2023 Deshaun Watson. That's what it equals. His entire playoff career. So I think he could be as low as where I have him, maybe even a little bit lower, and as high, if you want to really say it, as like 6 or something like that. But for me, I think I can't sit here and look at other people and be like, yeah, he's better than them, because they are already approaching what he has done for a whole career. Like Trevor, CJ, Tua. I mean, Tua is lower, but more so like CJ, and even just looking at golf, Trevor, because I don't have Trevor right here, obviously, meaning that I do have him higher. That like they've won a playoff game before, and they're so young, and I think they have so much more potential. And I would like to put Dak higher because I want to respect what he did, but the playoffs just were so shocking, and they totally blew it, that I just got to punish him. I need to see more playoff success if I want to put him higher, which is why I have golf ahead, and I'll get into golf. But do you want to jump into anything about Dak? Because I don't want to fully reveal where you have him, but obviously you do have him higher than 11.
Yeah, so I mean, you can see that in this range of quarterbacks. So I have him in my top 10. But so what I would say about Dak is, I do think if you just took, like, if there's just no playoffs, right? You just took regular season, I think most people would agree, like, hey, yeah, he's probably like a top 10. Yeah, he's probably like a top 10 quarterback. And so I do understand the playoff concerns and questions. Obviously, that's very real. My only thing with that, though, is I don't know how much of it is just like a Dak issue versus like just the Cowboys. Like, I know it's funny to like just joke about the Cowboys choking and stuff all the time, but that's like a real thing. Like, there's just something about the Cowboys where, like, even before Dak, like they had Tony Romo, like he's infamous for like bobbling the field goal snap to literally win a playoff game. So that's just something that like the Cowboys have just become routine to do. And so
it is. I would only say like the only thing is just like if he was like playing how like Baker did versus the Lions, or like how Trevor did a year or two ago versus the Chiefs, like, or how whatever quarterbacks you want to Stafford did versus the Lions this year in those playoff games where they lose. But it's like it was bad. Like, it was just, he had garbage time stuff.
Yeah.
But in the beginning, it was like, I know the defense led up to this stuff, but he was also turning the ball over,
for sure,
just like missing stuff. So that's just why I know it's not 100% on him. I know I made it seem to be like that, but that's
specifically against Green
Aiden
Bay.
O'Connell,
Specifically against Green Bay, yeah, he didn't play good at all. And I think even going back 2 years ago against the 49ers, he didn't play well in that game either. So there are instances where he's not played good, but I think even if you take a look like in the regular season against good teams, like he beat the Eagles last year, and even when he played at Philly, he was good against the Eagles. So I think there are instances where he can be good against those good teams, and then once he gets to the playoffs, I think kind of the pressure holds up on everybody on Dallas. Micah Parsons wasn't good against Green Bay, crazy. So I do see what you're saying there. I just buy Dak stock a little bit more because I think I do think he's in that tier of quarterbacks that's above kind of the mid guys, but he's not quite the kind of what you were saying where Bryce could kind of get. I feel like Dak is kind of in that tier of quarterbacks that's good. You can win a Super Bowl with him if he has a lucky like streak, kind of like what Joe Flacco did with the
Yeah, it's
Ravens.
just gotta have. Yeah, exactly. Kind of like Flack. It's
Yeah,
just I don't know when the hell it's gonna
and
happen,
that's fair.
and it's just so
Yeah,
weird because this was his best regular season.
yeah,
The advanced stats absolutely loved him too. He was
yep,
right there with Tua in terms of the best passer, and that's why I think the game was so shocking.
yeah,
Because like I know you picked them to go to the NFC title
yeah.
game,
I bought the
and
Cowboy stock, and
that
I'm
was
never doing
before
it
the
again.
season.
Yeah, I'm never doing it
That was
again.
yeah, that was before, that was before the season. But they were the 2 seed,
Yeah,
and when I made playoff predictions, I had them go to the title game.
yep.
Or no, I didn't. No, I didn't have. I had them winning the playoff game for sure, like 100%. I was like, no doubt about it. Like they're gonna win this game, and they just choked. So that's why they were the favorites at home 2 seed. It was his best regular season. This was the year, and that's why I am just so much lower because I'm like, well, what else needs to be?
Yeah, what else is going to change?
The team is only gonna get worse.
Yeah.
This offseason was bad.
Yep.
Unless they hit a ton on the draft and guys produce right away. But the O-line got worse, and for young guys, it takes a while for them to really build chemistry on the O-line. Defense is good, but they have a new DC now. So he's got to look inside himself, I guess. The running game's probably going to be worse, I don't know what it has to be. But
And I do wonder too. I mean, because I don't know if he's going to get extended before the season. Like, could this be his last year with the Cowboys?
Maybe, yeah, maybe.
Chance.
If they underperform, not necessarily because he was bad, but because the roster's worse,
Which definitely
maybe Mike gets
is in the cards.
Maybe, yeah, could happen. Maybe Mike gets fired and
Yep.
he moves on to another team that potentially pays him,
Yep.
which I think could be weird because I would not necessarily be completely opposed to paying him, but if you just look at the regular season stuff, that's fine. But then if he goes into this year, obviously he would be moving on to another team or McCarthy would be fired because they probably either underperformed in the playoffs or didn't make the playoffs,
Yeah.
So I don't know. He's also kind of similar to Tua, a weird situation, but it might be a little bit more streamlined in just that maybe he's just not consistent in the playoffs and just not it, and
That's
falls
fair.
apart and needs some kind of Flacco run.
Type
where
run,
at least
yeah.
Flacco literally did it. At least he did it,
Yeah.
like I guess Dak still has time, but we'll see. We'll see. But that's that. And that's the reason I have Goff ahead of him. And I think Goff is also just a tiny bit, I think we're overreacting a little bit, which is hard for me to say because I was very high on the Lions going into the year. And they did much better than I thought they would. At the beginning of the year, I had them winning a playoff game, and they actually won, 3 or 2? So they won 2. So props to them for sure, and had a great year. And their roster still looks really good. And I think he could have a similar year, which might push him up the boards for a good amount of people.
Yeah.
But I'm hearing people like Colin Cowherd or other guys like having him as like a top 5 quarterback, or like, hey, I trust him way more than all these other guys. And I just think it's a little bit too far. But I don't want to take away from his year. It's kind of hard because he was top 2 in yards. He was 4th in touchdowns, and he's here because he's like the baseline in terms of like a good QB, like pure prototype of like, we'll take advantage of what's around him for sure, and you can succeed. But if there's not a good amount of stuff around him, then you won't. Maybe kind of what you view Brock Purdy as, with him being at number 12 here. I do think if you pay him, it's going to backfire for sure, and they did pay him. And I think that will backfire. I think the worst thing you can do is pay a good quarterback, great quarterback money, and that's what a lot of teams do, and they don't really fully succeed. And I think that's going to backfire in the Lions in the future. That's why their window is next year. They should be they need to try and win a Super Bowl next year, and they will absolutely do that this upcoming season in terms of trying to. Like, they'll need to make the necessary trades. But, the only quarterbacks with the same or lower big time throw percentage are Derek Carr and Jimmy Garoppolo. If you're looking at the top 28 graded throwers of 2023, he makes about as many good, big, great throws as Carr and Jimmy. Now, he doesn't make a lot of turnover-worthy plays, but that's kind of why I have him at 12. His average depth of target was 38th, so not very high. Things around him were great. I think he had the third best surrounding cast, which obviously, I had expected as well. I think he has a great OC and Ben Johnson, who will be a head coach next year. The offensive line is one of the best, if not the best. It's totally complete. He has a great supporting run game, a top 5 receiving core, which that was the case last year according to PFF's advanced stats. And I think a total props to him because he didn't flop in the playoffs. And that's why I think he should be ahead of Dak, because he did not flop in the playoffs. He's a safer version of Dak. Dak has higher highs, especially in the regular season, but he has lower lows, and his lows apparently come in the playoffs, whereas Goff's don't, because he's more consistent. And I think Goff could get you to a Super Bowl, and I think he could live in a world where he could win one, but it, just potentially hasn't happened. And I think the reason I have him not in the top 10 is because we've seen this story before. Like, not very good when not very good is around him, very good when very good is around him, meaning he doesn't fully elevate the guys around him. And at this point in his career, I think his consistency helps him a ton in terms of being 12 and him actually producing. Like, he's produced, so that's why he's here. But I think he's just a little too high in terms of, maybe you could look at my top 10 and see he definitely had a better year than some of the guys in my top 10. But I think some of the guys in my top 10, if they're in the same scenario, are just better. So I don't want to throw shade at Goff, but I think I just need to defend why I have him a little bit lower, because I do think people are starting to run away a tiny bit with him being a little bit higher. I think you have Goff. I think you literally have the same placing or similar placing. It's just a little bit higher.
Yeah, I've got Goff a spot ahead of Dak. Same reasons, just playoff success, showing up in big spots. I do think Goff, I guess he's getting a little bit more hype now. I don't think he's like a top 5 guy, or, I mean, you'll see where I have him in a little bit, but I do think he is fairly underrated. I guess I don't really know what the masses are saying, like where the consensus of people.
I think they're kind of leaning towards higher, which in my opinion makes him a tiny bit overrated because he just got paid a ton.
Then if he's higher than 12,
the second highest average paid quarterback.
I do think then if the consensus is he's top 10, I do think that's kind of right. I'm fairly high on Goff because if you even go back to the Rams, I mean, he had a fairly good couple of seasons there as well. And yeah, he does have some limitations in terms of he can't really move that well. He needs some good offensive linemen. He's not fantastic under pressure, but you see what happens when you build an offensive line for him. I mean, he was amazing last year, and he competed against the 40. They should have beaten the 49ers and went on to the Super Bowl. I mean, that's a real thing. They had a huge lead in that game.
I just don't think it's disrespectful to have him 12 because I think
I don't think
the idea of like you do. I think it's very hard. People understand to have a good O-line. Like, all 5 guys are good, or like he succeeded when McVay came along, and now when Ben Johnson is here, because he didn't just come to Detroit and kicked it off. Like, they had to build stuff and get all these guys together, and they had amazing drafts, like very, very good drafts, multiple years in a row. So I just think 12 is the proper rating for what you're portraying in terms of like how he is as a quarterback. And I like, for sure you can make a Super Bowl and win a Super Bowl with number 12. Like, I do think that's possible. I think there's a lot of good quarterbacks that you can win with. I think there's just a certain limit in terms of how potentially good your roster has to be, for them to succeed. Didn't mean to cut you off there, but that's, my response to that.
I think I'm just a little bit higher on Goff. I think he is the highest degree of what a really good quarterback before you get into that elite type of tier. I think that's really what Goff is. I mean, he's got a good arm as well. Can make pretty much any throw. Not super good when, like I said, when he has to move off his spot, but I'm fairly high on Goff. I think really what he's done for the Lions, kind of turning around his career after the Rams dumped him and people were calling him, maybe a potential backup quarterback eventually. After he got traded to the Lions, people didn't think he would be there in 3 years and sign a new extension. So I think Goff is going to continue to just put up really good numbers, make the playoffs, win some playoff games, and I just think He's a really good player and as good as you can get with his physical attributes.
I think next year has got to be it. Because I think in 2 years his cap hit is like 60 plus, and he just he's not going to elevate guys. He's just not, and they're paying people right now. So the window's now, and he could totally win a Super Bowl or make a Super Bowl, and I could put him a little bit higher. But I think as a pure quarterback, this is correct as to what he is. But then we have, I don't want to spoil it, but our 11s are interesting because I think I think the hype train on CJ, the more you look into it, needs to slow down just a little bit. Just a little bit. In terms, I'll bring up some stats for you. In terms of, which by the way, I don't think 11 is disrespectful. I think people will have him higher, but that's why I think I have him at 11 because I think we need to chill. In terms of the difference between turnover worthy plays that actually became turnovers, his was at 29%, meaning 29% of his turnover worthy plays actually became interceptions. That was the bottom. I think the second lowest for starters, meaning that he's kind of just getting lucky last year in terms of what plays actually became picks, which obviously raises his passer rating, which raises his perception clearly. He was the only quarterback to start a majority of the year and not have a single interception under pressure, even though he was top 10 in turnover worthy plays under pressure. That's not happening again. That's just not. I think the year was not as insane as people seem to remember. He had one good game versus an at least above average defense. The Bucks game really inflated his stats. 470 yards on 5 touchdowns at home versus a below average pass defense and pass rushing group, which they're probably going to have the worst pass rushing group in the NFL this most recent upcoming season. But I don't want to sound like I'm hating him because I don't. That's why I had him at 11. He was the best deep ball thrower, just like Geno last year. So he's obviously very good. He, I think, has Diggs now, is going to be, I think, with the increase in terms of stuff that's around him, because he's got Diggs, the O-line is now healthier. I think he's going to play, in terms of if you're just looking at his straight passer rating, I think it's going to be similar. I don't think it's going to take some increase, because I think a lot of the high perception that he had last year was due to some unprecedented luck, but potentially improving his play as a rookie, as well as not having the most insane luck ever as a quarterback for turnovers, kind of like the opposite of Kenny Pickett, will eventually be like, okay, like this is, kind of his thing now. But I think could be for sure a top 10 guy. I think there's guys in the top 10 that could fall down, even just this most recent year, and I'd be totally fine putting him up there. But him being like in the top, I don't know, 8-ish range, I just think that's a little far, because I think I know he's a rookie, but him coming out, he was known as like, okay, Bryce has a higher ceiling, but CJ has a little bit of a higher floor, but he's more of a prototypical, like, better size for a quarterback. And I think he did so much better than a lot of people expected, but I think the Texans roster was better than a lot of people expected, and the coaching and the offensive play calling. But I want to give him credit. I don't want to hate him, because he won a playoff game and was very good. Obviously, ended up losing against the Ravens, but I don't fully blame him, because that was a hard game. It was at the Ravens. They're a very good defense. So I don't know. I don't want to hate him at all. I just think there needs to be a little bit of realism thrown in, kind of like with Goff, in terms of like how the perception viewed them after the season, and what a lot of the game show, or just a lot of what the game has kind of shown, and what all their stats kind of show in terms of them being just like right around here. Because there's a guy ahead of them that was totally worse, and you might be able to know who it is, that I have higher, and I'll have to justify that. And I understand people that have him higher than them. Mine, I'm just going kind of based off how I feel their talent is, but that's kind of my takeaway for CJ Stroud. A lot of these guys I have lower than you. You have higher than them. But before we move on to the or I'll let you respond to the CJ thing when we move on to this next slide, because this is the second to last slide before the top, and I believe you have him on this slide, so you can just go ahead and get into him now. So this is our from 10 through 6. You can see the rankings here. I'll defend some of the guys that I have on this rankings. As you can see, Trevor at 10, Jordan Love at 9, Hurts at 8, Rodgers at 7, Stafford at 6. You have Love at 10, Dak at 9, Goff at 8, CJ at 7, and Herbert at 6. So I have him at, I have 11, 12, 13. You have 7, 8, 9. You already went through your 2 with Goff and Dak. Now you can go ahead and respond to CJ Stroud.
CJ Stroud is just amazing, man. You can just sometimes you can just watch a dude and you just know like right away this guy's just special. And I feel like that's part of the reason why he might be a little bit overrated and why I'm pretty high on him after like one season. But I mean, he just
like his personality.
No, not even just his personality. I'm just saying, just watching what he could do as a 22-year-old in his first
like
ever starts.
Rookie.
Yeah. I'm just talking about just lighting up defenses, making off-script plays, off his back foot, throwing lasers, carrying the Texans, which were the second worst team in the league, and then he joins the team, and then they win 10 games. I mean, that's.
They also did change coach.
They changed coach, but if they had the same, but why did Nico Collins break out? I think that's CJ Stroud.
I do think it's both, yeah, for sure.
Because Nico Collins,
but I do think it's partly him.
Because Nico was in the league for what, 2 or 3 years with some
2
years with not
Davis Mills.
Yeah, not very good quarterbacks, and nobody saw Nico ever being like an 1,000-yard receiver. You bring in CJ Stroud, and dude, I mean, he turned into a stud. And then I think the coaching staff definitely helped. I mean, I think D'Amico's a really good coach, but I think even if D'Amico didn't have CJ Stroud, I mean, personally, you might push back if they had Bryce Young. I don't think they win 10 games. I think CJ Stroud was a huge reason why they had that much success that last year. And so,
no, I'm not gonna. There's no. The draft process with CJ had a higher ceiling. I mean, Bryce had a higher ceiling. And even if we just throw away the draft process stuff, the draft process stuff is still relatively valid because it's what the players like look at as prospects going into the NFL. Obviously, a lot of that changes, but some of it kind of still stays relatively similar. But I do think obviously the opinion of both of them has gone for sure down and for sure up after the class. And it's hard for someone to say after 1 year, yeah, Bryce should still be 1 and CJ should be 2. I do still think, though, that a lot can change in all this time, especially with Bryce. I don't think CJ is going to have some big fall off because, like you said, he for sure had great stuff. I just, looking at a lot of the stuff, I think part of it's a little bit overrated.
Yeah,
but
some of the
I think he could be top 10.
Some of the turnover stuff is valid, but then just my thing with that is he was a rookie, so next year he's not going to have those. I mean, maybe his luck won't be as good, but I don't think he'll be in that many situations because he'll have a whole year of experience under his belt. He'll know the offense. He'll know what defenses are thrown at him. I just think he had a top 3. I mean, I would even argue probably the best rookie season for a quarterback ever if you consider just going to the playoffs, winning a playoff game. But even if you don't want to say that, I think it's probably a top 3 quarterback season for a rookie.
Yeah, yeah.
And I just think he's going to continue to get better because he gets another year under his belt. He's got a new weapon now. He's got Joe Mixon in the backfield now as well. He's got another year in the offense with Bobby Slowick. So I just think C.J. Stroud's going to be even better next year. And, I mean, obviously that's why you got to be a little bit precautious. I understand your point of not wanting to have him too high after one season, which definitely is valid. But I'm kind of just projecting a little bit because I was pretty high on him in the draft. And I'm kind of just, at this point, I'm just going to try to push in all my chips and just say, like, he's just going to become like a consensus, like top 7, top 5 quarterback for like years to come.
What Tua wasn't. Right. What Tua was supposed to be.
Yeah.
Basically, for especially for your draft stuff. But no, I get the hype. I know a lot of people have it. I just, from everything I looked at and saw, and I don't want to come off as a hater, I just thought we were doing a little too much. But I would easily put him in the top 10. I could see that for sure. And obviously you can see number 10 here, and I think we didn't even talk about him because you had him at 16, which 16 to 10 is relatively high, a relatively big difference. And I'm also kind of hedging a lot of my bets for him because he's very hard to place, but I think everything around him has just been like just bad objectively, especially early on, like horrendous. So he really didn't have a rookie year. And then his second year, which you could even look at as his rookie year, he improved a ton and was like pretty good. And then won a playoff game. Yes, he had, picks, which if you watch that game, he didn't have 4 horrendous picks. He had like 2. And the other 2 picks were just like drop passes and stuff like that, or tipped stuff. So it really could have not been a big comeback at all. It could have just been the Jags winning. But after that first half, him having one of the best comebacks in playoff history at his second year, when his first year was with Urban Meyer and it went horribly and he had no help at all, is a pretty big deal. And then he goes to the Chiefs and borderline wins that game and played good on the road in Kansas City. So I totally believe in the potential. I just really do. And I think before his injury, he was playing super well, and then after it, he was still playing while he was injured, and it really tanked down a lot of the stuff. After his injury in Week 14, the second injury, by the way, because he was already injured beforehand, everything fell off. But beforehand, he was top 5 in big-time throw percentage. Pre his first injury, which I think was sometime in the middle of the season, he was way better under pressure than CJ, which injuries, obviously limited his ability under pressure, and he's not in his rookie year, which I totally get it, but we're just kind of going based off, okay, going into next year, what are they going to be? And I think just comparing each playoff run, they both got a W, but Trevor was better in his second one and went out and won. He just had more game-winning throws in general in both games, and just looking at them both, even last year, the time to throw for Trevor was 38th. Like, it was not very good. I think CJ's was like 9th or something like that. I'm not trying to crap on him. I'm just explaining the differences of why I have him above in terms of 11 to 10. And you could say, hey, CJ only had 1 year. It's like, yeah, that's totally fine. Like, he can do that. But I think he was a little more NFL ready. And I think we're comparing next year. So Trevor could hit that final boom next year because this will be his, third or fourth year. This will be his 4th year, but I'm viewing it as a 3rd because his rookie year was totally botched. And I think last year was what people were envisioning as, hey, this is his breakout, and it was happening, and then he got injured. So now going into next year, I think his receiving core is better with Brian Thomas Jr. The O-line is more – sometimes it takes a year for the O-line to really get together. They got a year now. Evan Ingram, I think, is a good tight end. The defense, they tried to make upgrades. I do like Doug Peterson as a coach. I think he's, he's solid. He's not insane or anything, but I think he's solid. And I think if he's healthy this year, I think we could actually see what Trevor should and could be. And that, in my opinion, at least, is a top 10 quarterback. And I understand people not having him higher because of the year that he had. But I think pre-injury, he was playing really well. And I think the injury really botched it. And I think he can go into next year and end up playing much better and kind of what people thought he would play last year.
Yeah, I'm just kind of done with Trevor at this point. I just need to see it to believe it at this point because he's entering year 4, and the whole thing about him was, oh my gosh, he's the greatest prospect since Andrew Luck or Peyton Manning, and maybe he was pretty good 2 years ago during that playoff run, but he was not the generational player that he was touted to be. So I'm kind of just fed.
I mean, he could still not be that and still be where he is,
Yeah,
top 10
he can, but I don't think he's played as a top 10 quarterback for enough. Yeah, so I'm
just projecting.
So I'm kind of just done with the projecting stuff for him because last year I had him, I think, in my top. I think I might have had him higher than number 10.
We both had him.
Yeah, and so I was like, I was expecting him to continue off that playoff run, and
I targeted him in fantasy in the leagues that we had, and you know,
Yeah. I,
I didn't make the
I,
playoffs, so
I thought he was going to continue that and do really well. And I mean, I guess the year started off fairly good. I think they started 8-3 and then had a massive fall off at the end of the season. And the injuries definitely played a part and all that. But I mean, at the end of the day, what happened is what happened. And I need to see it from him to really buy in. And I don't think his situation with Doug Peterson and his weaponry has been that bad. I mean, last year and the year before. I mean, we'll just go last year. I mean, he had ETN and Evan Ingram and Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk. I mean, those guys are not like Tyreek Hill and Justin Jefferson, but those are.
I do think Calvin Ridley, by the way, is one of the most overrated
Yeah, I mean,
receivers.
we don't have to get into
But
specifics,
you
but
know,
I'm just
that's
saying
fine.
that they have more than he has more than enough a supporting cast to be a to look better than he has. I mean, he doesn't have a Bryce Young or a like a I'm trying like a Derek Carr type of weaponry. Like he doesn't have that level of poor weapons around him, and I just really haven't seen it from him. So maybe he turns around this year. I'm hoping that he does because when he's playing good, he's a fun player to watch. But I'm just kind of done with the Trevor Lawrence hype. I just want him to prove it at this point. So that's kind of why I have him so behind. Like other guys like Tua and Kirk that have at least for more than like a half a season shown that they can be productive and put up a lot of numbers. Obviously, I think Trevor has higher ceilings than those guys, stronger arm, more mobile, better size, all that. But I'm just kind of sick and tired of it. And he's got to prove it to me that he can be one of those guys. And I think he's about to get paid probably $50 million soon as well. So the pressure just continues to rise.
Yeah, I think it's interesting who we have as projecting to be better and also like just lower. I don't know. It's just we have similar thinkings with different guys, but it's interesting who we have them towards
Yeah,
and not. But I do think, at least for me, I do believe it, and I think a lot of it is kind of shrouded in terms of like you got to look at what happened in these seasons, and I do think if it's not this year, then I get it, and we can move him
that's
down.
fair.
But I think he'll do it. I think he'll do. But that's we'll see, we'll see. But then we have Jordan Love, who was one of the biggest shockers for sure of the season. He was a little bit hard to rank just because of his limited sample size, but I think objectively in the second half of the year, he was a top 5 quarterback, and that's why he's rated so high now. I do think it should be acknowledged that Matt LaFleur, it was one of his best coaching jobs this year, and he did a phenomenal job. And there were a good amount of schemed touchdowns to very young receivers who did a good job producing, but they still aren't these like crazy like big time receivers that he had. And Christian Watson was hurt a lot of the year. Um, Beyond like the first 7 weeks that he had, after that, Love was second in touchdowns to Dak and second in touchdowns and in yards to Dak Prescott through that time. He had an even higher rating under pressure than he did clean, which is fair. Or he had a higher rating under pressure, than he did clean, which is very interesting during that part of the year. I think the only reason he's above certain guys, like at least for me, especially Dak, but even Goff, I think with Goff specifically, I think he is just more talented and is able to do more with less. And if he was in the Lions, they would have gone to the Super Bowl. But in terms of just, especially Dak, for me, is that playoff game. I couldn't look, and I could not look at my list and say, okay, Dak is here and then Love is here in terms of Love being lower. I just could not do it after that playoff game. I just can't get over it, especially when Dallas had a top 5 defense on the road, his first playoff game, going against a great defense and totally exposing them, making all the throws in the beginning, making it not even a game, and totally outplaying Dak versus a worse defense that he was playing. Like, I'm very shocked with how his season went, and I think he could be insanely dangerous if he picks up where he left off. Now, I think it'd be very hard to do that, but it's possible, especially with a better roster. So even if he falls off a little bit, I still think the top 10 range is probably where he could be if you put his full like season together, kind of like how he played, where the first half he just kind of had to get his feet off the ground because it was his first full season. But I was very shocked with his season, and I think the future's pretty bright, and this kind of might be around where he is. But I wouldn't be surprised if he reaches like the 7-6 range at his very high peak. That's a very high possibility for him.
Yeah, I agree. Again, on all accounts, we pretty much have him in the same spot. I mean, 10 for me, 9 for you. That's relatively the same. Only reason why I didn't have him higher and have like Dak and Jared Goff ahead of him is it was only like a half a season. So I want to see at least another half of a year before I put him ahead of people like Dak and Goff. And the reason why I have Stroud ahead, Stroud was a rookie in his first year. Although this was like the first year Love played, he did have like 4 years or 3 years to develop behind Rodgers, get coaching up, get accumulated to the NFL and how everything goes. And he's not relatively like a young player now. He's in like his mid 20s. So he's not going to, I mean, I guess with more experience, he could get better, but this is roughly, what we saw probably towards the end of the season, what he's going to be. And if he's more towards that than what he was at the beginning of the year, I think you're right. He could be a top 5, top 7 quarterback. But I just want to see a little bit more before I, go all in on Love and say, hey, this guy could be really, really special because, yeah, I think it was only really a handful of games, towards the end of the year where he really turned into something special. Whereas, Dak, I've seen him be special for, a couple seasons now. I think even if you just compare their seasons, you could say Dak had a better season than Love in terms of the regular season and in the total capacity. And I do get your point about the playoff game. Love was fit.
I mean, that's why I have him lower.
Yeah.
Like I had gone on about the regular season. That's just why I have him lower.
And so that's definitely a fair argument to make. But I just think right now, I think this is a good spot for Love, but easily, I think if 6 or 7 games into the season, if he's still balling out, I would definitely move him up higher than, Dak Goff and maybe Stroud, just really seeing how he does.
I think we're higher than other people anyways from all the stuff I saw. I'm not sure too many had him there. Some did buy it a ton,
Yeah.
but
I
some
mean,
had him
I buy him.
outside of the
I
top
buy him,
10.
yeah.
Yeah, but I do think when you talk about the Stroud thing, I just think this isn't like what the quarterbacks based on all of these different surrounding things in terms of like it's only been this many years or whatever. This is like the rankings next year. So like, that's kind of why I think it's like, yeah, Love is this high partly because he's been able to sit behind the second most talented quarterback of all time for 3 years, so that's part of the reason why, but he still is like in this top range. And I do think, for me above Stroud, but, it was funny because I'll skip over Hurts real quick. Our 7 and 11 are both swapped. I have CJ Stroud at 11. You have Rodgers at 11. You have CJ Stroud at 7. I have Rodgers at 7. I think more people would agree or be tailored to agree with yours. I understand my take with Stroud is lower, but I said all my piece on that.
Yeah.
But Rodgers, I'm not dying on a hill at 7. I'm just not. Like, I didn't really know where to put him, to be honest. He was kind of hard. He could be here or he could be 11 or 12. Like, I'm hesitant to put him here. I could totally see 2 more guys jump ahead of him or him jump ahead of 2 more guys, like, and be on the ranking here. I'm not hell-bent on this ranking. He's just here for respect, to be honest. I respect him and his play. I don't want to throw him out because last time we did that, he won 2 MVPs.
Yep.
And I think the Jets did address the O-line for sure in free agency and the draft. They got more weapons. Mike Williams and Malachi Corley is one of my favorite players in the class, and they got him. He'll be great in the slot immediately. But the OC is bad.
Very
I
bad.
understand that. And but the defense is amazing. It's very good, and it'll only help him. I think people don't understand how amazing it was. And if he's actually freaking healthy, they finally have some sort of semblance on offense, and I think the defense can help take advantage of that and help him a little bit. But I see the lower ranking. He's just kind of here for respect a little bit, and I do think they helped him in the offseason.
Yeah, so similar thing for me. I had him ranked at 11 because of respect. I just had, I guess, a little bit less respect for him than you did, but I definitely think, anywhere in this range I can get on board with. Just when I think about Rodgers, though, he hasn't been Rodgers, like the Rodgers that we're accustomed to seeing since like I think 2021 was the last
Well, I
time.
mean, he had that one year with the Packers where his last year where they had all the young
That's
receivers.
what
Like that
yeah.
was their first year that were there, and he already had all these issues with COVID. We already know all that crap, and he was not
Yeah,
amazing.
he
Yeah,
was
he was
not good.
fine. He was a good quarter. He was good, but he wasn't
He wasn't
Rodgers.
Rodgers,
Which I
exactly.
understand.
And
And then he obviously got
the
hurt.
last thing I remember from that game, though, or from that season, is when Jared Goff went into Lambeau
Lions
Field and knocked him out of the playoffs.
and the playoffs.
So, and then you go to this year and he tears his Achilles. So it's been a couple years now that Rodgers has been his MVP, top five, top whatever quarterback.
Only thing is, it's been 1 year of playing, and I do think that was because a lot of the stuff got worse.
Well,
So that's why I do have him higher.
1 year of playing, but yeah, but he is going to be 40 years old now, though, off an Achilles.
No, he is, yeah, and that'll hurt a lot of stuff. I think his Achilles won't change his talent of like throwing the ball off his back foot.
Well,
Like
I
perfectly.
disagree a little bit there because I do think mobility is a big part of his game. And I don't know how well because even before his Achilles, if you even look on that opening drive, I mean, he got hurt because he couldn't escape. And prime,
Yeah, because they had I don't know who was at tackle. Maybe the guy who's not even on the team anymore. I forget his name, who they drafted because they got beat like 3 times or something like that.
oh, Mekhi Becton. Yeah.
Which is valid, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's why I have him higher because I think he could be lower at around like 9 or whatever or 8. But I think because they drafted an O line and signed 2 really big tackles,
Yeah.
that's kind of why I have him higher. But I do understand if he's lower. I think I think what you're saying makes sense. I just think looking at that one game might be too much in terms of having him much lower because
Well, I don't,
the
not
other team
necessarily
ended
that.
his season there.
Not necessarily because of that one game. I mean, the whole season he wasn't super good. I mean, I think he had 25 touchdowns, and for Rodgers, that's probably his worst season fully healthy in like,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, the last like 10 years. So when I see that and a player is getting older and older, it just to me it shows signs of him just not playing as good. And I know the whole weaponry and having rookie receivers and everything, but then I look at like Jordan Love, like last year. I mean, he had a bunch of young receivers too. I know some of them were older, like Christian Watson was a year older, but he was hurt for the majority of the season. Love still had a bunch of rookie receivers, and
Which I think part of it was almost a detriment to Rodgers in terms of like I think it was also Love being like, yeah, sure, I'll listen. I think it was Mike LaFleur's best coaching job.
I
And I think it was Love being like, yeah, sure, we'll do this, rather than Rodgers being like, what the heck are you doing? Or I'm gonna
mean,
do
maybe
this
so,
or that.
but I kind of
Like, I don't think he handled it super well.
maybe so, but I put that into consideration. So that's why I think I would rank Love ahead of Rodgers because the last time I've seen both of them play on the Packers, I think Love was the better player. So I just think Rodgers is really fascinating because you're right. If the offensive line is really solid and he can just sit in the pocket and just throw darts, I still think he has a great arm talent and maybe he can still have a great season. But if the offensive line is shaky or people can get after him and he can't move around like he could before, then there could be some issues. So I just thought putting him at 11 is an okay spot. I mean, I definitely could see, and
I'm not freaking out over that anyways.
I could
understand.
see like in 9 months, people, oh, Rodgers at 11 is crazy. Like if he has a great season, the Jets win a playoff game or two. But I'm just kind of fading
I
that.
think I could also see Rodgers at 7 being like, what are you talking about? And he's down at like 11 or
Yeah.
12.
He's just
or
a hard
15 or
player, like you
something
said.
that.
He's just hard to pinpoint.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the thing. We'll see what happens there. But next one will be Jalen Hurts.
Yeah,
And I think I'm just objectively probably just higher on Hurts.
yeah,
8 to 13 is relatively large. I think part of it is also because I think the Eagles will be really good this year, and I think they have the best GM, and he once again proved why he's the best GM, and Howie Roseman. Now, obviously, it seemed like a lesser year for him because of the team, but I don't really think it was because of Hurts. The supporting run game was just not there. Swift had a total schemed up and run blocking 1,000 yards. Don't think very highly of him. Don't think he's going to do a ton with the Bears. Hertz's throwing ability didn't really fall off, to be honest. It was almost like he was just getting a little bit more unlucky, especially when you watch some of the games. It'd be like a third down and long. You just got to get it deep, and oh, it's a pick because it was, AJ Brown gave up on the route, or they just got in front of Devontae Smith or something like that. And the stats do back that up. He had 16 turnover-worthy plays and 15 interceptions, so that's one of the worst ratios in the entire league. His OC and running game is going to be better this year, plus his defense, which I think helps in avoiding a team collapse, because I think we try and find the answer to that horrible team collapse. I think it was coaching plus coordinators were not good. I don't think the coordinators were good, and I think the coaching of I blanking on their head coach's name, but I think he's just a placeholder as a coach. I don't think insanely highly of him, but I think it was kind of telling in terms of Tua literally being way more mature than their head coach, which was kind of interesting. I don't think that helped when you're not winning a ton. But my reason for having Hurts over Love and all these other guys is I think the rushing ability has just been better, and he's better under pressure for sure. And I think obviously Hurts had OC issues last year, and they're going to be so much better this year, in my opinion, for both of those. And now he has Saquon Barkley, who is just a straight up better running back and will help out the running game a ton. And I just have a lot of respect for his 2022-2023 Super Bowl run, because while I think you look at guys like Brock Purdy and other guys like that and be like, the team was great, but you can tell the difference of a team being great and the player being great. And I think that shows in the Eagles, because Jalen Hurts was great in the Super Bowl. He was great. They didn't lose that game because of Hurts. He made a very crucial mistake, and it was also not fully his fault in terms of the fumble that happened, which led to a touchdown that was the difference maker in the Super Bowl. But that was the only mistake. Like, he was very, very good and insanely impressive, and went above and beyond with all of the stuff that was around him in Steve Sarkisian being there last year. So that's kind of what I view as, like, he took advantage, won multiple playoff games, and was very good with all this good stuff around him. And that's why I think very highly of him. I do acknowledge his stats. If you just look at the stats, like, his rushing touchdowns are totally inflated, for sure. But I think they will probably go down next year. But I think the overall efficiency and part of that will go up, because the running game is going to be there way more than it was last year. The O-line is obviously great. We know he has great receivers, but I think they're going to be great in part because I do think he does. I do believe in his talent. I think he's talented. And I think last year he didn't have some big fall off that a lot of people think when the OC left. And now that they have a viable OC, I think he could get back to what he does. And a little early prediction, I do think they're going to be back in the NFC title game next year. And that's just my opinion, but I do know I have a higher opinion of Hurts than you do.
Yeah, I didn't love Hurts when he came out of college. And for the first, I think, 2 years of his career, he was behind Carson Wentz and then took over for him. And he was an okay player, kind of just like a guy that wasn't good passing, but could kind of run around, make some plays. And then year 3 came along, and they traded for A.J. Brown, and they drafted Devontae Smith, and it was year 2 of Smitty. They had Shane Steichen take over as offensive coordinator, and then he had an MVP caliber year. And if he didn't get hurt down the stretch of that season, he probably would have won it over Mahomes. I know that was a pretty talked about debate.
I think so, yeah.
He might have won it that year, but I just have never been a huge fan of Hurts and his game. I just don't really like quarterbacks that can't consistently win from the pocket, and I still just don't think Hurts can consistently win from the pocket. And last year, the big thing that teams figured out is just blitz Hurts. And part of the reason, I mean, if you look at the numbers, he was like statistically like the worst quarterback against the blitz in the league. And part of that was because the offensive scheme and the reaction to those blitzes by Brian Johnson, who, they kicked to the road, it was not good. So that's not all his fault, but I think it does also show his shortcomings as a passer. And so I think Hurts is still, he could definitely move up my rankings. He could be higher than 13. I'm just kind of on fraud watch with him a little bit because out of his 4 seasons, he's had one that's good. Like objectively, he's only had one season that was like, yeah, he's a really good player, and that was with who I think is a really good offensive mind and really good talent around him. Because even then, he had probably the best offensive line in the league. He had Dallas Goddard, who I think is easily a top 10 tight end, and then he had AJ Brown. He had Devontae Smith. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. I mean, I know we talk about like Brock Purdy and his weaponry a lot, and I've kind of mentioned them before. I think to you before about like how their supporting cast is similar, and I do think that kind of gets passed by a little bit with Hurts in terms of I don't think people really notice what he's had around him the last couple of years, and so I don't want to give him all the blame for last year, but I don't want to give him all the credit either for 2 years ago. And you made a good point. He was good in the Super Bowl. Pretty, might have been, if you consider the stakes, the best game of his life. I mean, he
Yeah, I that's you bring up Purdy. That's why I have such a big discrepancy because we've seen them both on the big stage. You're right, they do have both good stuff. I do think the 49ers stuff is better. And if you place Jalen Hurts' performance on the Niners last year, they win the Super Bowl. So that's also kind of my thinking there. But you can continue.
I just think just Hurts overall. I think this is just a fairly decent range for him. I think obviously he can move up, but I just think the guys that have ahead of him, I would trust more to I guess facilitate my offense. And I guess for me personally, I like more traditional drop back passing offenses. I would like these guys ahead of him, and I just don't think I think Hurts is very scheme reliant because of his lack of passing I guess traits. I just don't think highly of him as a passer at all. And in terms as a runner, I think he was banged up last year, so he couldn't run as much. I don't think the tush push is going to be as successful this year because Jason Kelsey's retired. So it'll be interesting. I do think I agree with you that the Eagles are going to be a lot better next year because two new coordinators. They address their defense. Their defense will be a lot better next year. I think Kellen Moore will fix some of the issues that Brian Johnson struggled to fix, but I don't know. I've just never really been that high in Hurts, and I think last year I had him ranked pretty high, but I kind of had some confirmation bias with his season last year of him not playing too well, but we'll see.
Hurts had the most picks when blitzed, but his general like just rating when he was blitzed was top 10, and he had more interceptions than he did turnover worthy plays, which is not the case for any other player besides Jimmy Garoppolo, who had 3 picks. So part of it is a little bit of like, hey, football stuff happens. But yeah, it wasn't, as good as you would expect. But that's just a player slash just style discrepancy in terms of the rankings there. That's kind of what that is. And then we're almost at the end here. I know it's been super long, but these two guys are flipped basically. Shocker, for number 6 and number 5 between Matthew Stafford and sorry, I revealed it there quickly. Between Matthew Stafford and Justin Herbert. My ranking to have Herbert higher is just not fully because of the Tuith or because of the Trevor thing, but in slight part, which I can get to Herbert, after you talk about him. But for me, having Stafford at 6, I think more people need to recognize his talent, and I'm glad that you do. I'm surprised you have him even higher than I do. He was first in big time throws. He had the lowest turnover worthy play percentage amongst those who had very high big time throws. So he was making a ton of great throws, not turning the ball over, and had the highest drop percentage. So I think that says a lot there. His receiving and pass blocking grade was near the worst for offenses that were ranked in the top 10 in passing, which the Rams were. His under pressure grade is lower, obviously, because he's not a mobile guy, but he's very smart in not creating just like poor mistakes, and I think he still makes great throws when under pressure. He in that playoff game, it was just not his fault for sure. I think we both can acknowledge that he was very good. And I think if he was on the 49ers or Lions, they would be Super Bowl champions. That's just my opinion. But I think very highly of him. I think he's super talented. I think he is a great quarterback and has proven it. I'm so glad he won a Super Bowl, and I'm kind of excited to see what he does with the Rams. Hold on. Okay, you can go.
Yeah, I think Stafford is maybe the most underrated quarterback in the league. I think he got his props after he won his Super Bowl, but routinely he was not seen as an elite guy. And if you just watch him, man, I mean, in that Lions game, I mean,
So
it was
cool.
just these
It's so
sidearm,
cool.
just these just unbelievable just dots. And I mean, you could tell just in terms of just roster talent, he was pretty overmatched in that game. But I just think his talent is just undeniable. I think he's just a really good player. And when you add in the postseason success and that he's won a Super Bowl, I think he deserves to be in the top five.
Now you can get into Herbert since you have him one spot lower.
And Herbert, I just have him behind Stafford really just because of that playoff success. Herbert, I still think he's almost like he might be like on a little Stafford arc almost. Like he goes to a team that is run pretty poorly, and he does not have a ton of winning success, but he puts up a lot of good numbers. And then he gets a new coach, Jim Harbaugh, and maybe he turns things around. But I think for right now, just with his talent and the amount of seasons and productions he's put together, I think he deserves to be in this spot. But I think I would just take Stafford over him just because of his resume and just off of last year as well. The last couple years, I think Herbert, his numbers has been a little bit down, and it's not entirely all his fault, obviously. But I'm just gonna ride with Stafford right now going into the season, have him one spot ahead. And hey, if Herbert surprises us next year and maybe makes a playoff push when nobody is going to be predicting the Chargers to do so, maybe we can have another discussion. But I think I like this for right now.
Yeah, I'm kind of shocked you have him at 6. I expect you to have him much lower. Um, so I'm glad you have him there, and I understand having him lower because Harry had a better season, and part of the Herbert thing is just because I respect his talent so much and I just think he's been in such a bad situation, and this is. I was gonna say this is my guilty pleasure as well, having him in the top 5, but I mean you have him at 6, so it's not that big of a difference. I think if Herbert was in many other situations, he would be viewed as a no-brainer top 5 quarterback, maybe even top 3. That's my opinion. Um, I think he has had the worst head coach in the NFL since he's been there. I've absolutely hated Braden Staley for so long. So glad he's out of there now. If you followed my channel at all or my podcast, I've hated Staley and we talked about it for so long. He had an injury last year, had a hand fracture on both hands. Before the first hand fracture to his non-throwing hand, he had six touchdowns, 1,000 yards in only 3 games. He had to get used to wearing a splint and a wrap on his non-throwing hand, but after a few weeks of doing that, he was starting to hit his stride, and then he fractured his throwing hand, which ended his season. The receiving game last year was a little bit unhealthy, but this year is not going to be ideal. Last year, the running game was not there at all, for sure. Eckler is definitely more of a receiving back, not just like a pure runner. And the defense was below average, for sure. And the coaching was bad. But I think this year, the stats aren't going to really jump off the page, and I understand that because the receivers are worse, and Greg Roman is going to prioritize the run. But I think Herbert is going to be the only reason the offense will be any sort of threat at all. And I think it may lead to an overall lower opinion of him in terms of like his stats might be lower, but I think he's going to be more efficient, and I think it just is going to go to prove his true ranking. I just think the ranking I have now is almost kind of like a bet that I'm hedging that I think one day will pay off. That I think, funny enough, that you bring up Stafford could be the same case, except maybe it's not with a new team. Maybe it is with the Chargers,
Yeah.
but the Chargers' history of having quarterbacks, maybe that's not the case. But I think it was great that he got Harbaugh in there because whatever people think about Harbaugh, all he's done is win. That's all he on both levels. And Hardly anyone has been able to do that. It'll take a year at least to build a lot of the stuff around him, but the O-line is much better now. The receivers aren't amazing, but I think he is a guy that can elevate others around him. And I think they should still go out and sign some other type of receiver. There's a few receivers out there maybe they could get. I still think they should get another one. But, again, I would expect next year he might have lower stats and people put him lower. But I think in the future that would look bad because I do think he is the range of quarterbacks that we both have him in, or the range of just in general rankings that we both have him in.
Yeah, it's gonna be
Anything to say?
it's gonna be interesting to see what happens with Harbaugh, for sure. I think it could be one of those things where his numbers are down because, like you mentioned, I mean, the offense is going to be centered around the run with Greg Roman coming in and just the philosophy that Jim Harbaugh likes to play. But I think he could have more team success, and it's kind of a balancing act of of you take maybe a little less stats, but you can win more games. So I think in the grand scheme of things, yeah, this is probably a good spot for him. And yeah, I think definitely next year that could be something that happens if the Chargers are not super good and his numbers are not great, where people are like, oh yeah, Herbert, he's not this good. But I think this is a good spot.
All right, then we go into the top 5. It'll reveal all of them at once. I think you should know who they are, to be honest. But their rankings are all different except one of them. So I will reveal that now. These are our top 5. We just went over number 5 for each of us. I have Lamar 4, Allen 3, Burrow 2, with obviously Mahomes being 1, and Mathis has Burrow 4, Lamar 3, Allen 2, and Mahomes obviously 1. Let's talk about all 3 of these guys in terms of placing them, because I think everyone agrees they
Top
are
4.
top. They are. I think these are the top
Yeah.
4. Yeah, I think people who are not idiots know or aren't biased fans understand these are the top 4 for sure. I would say mine is probably slightly more shocking and more indicative of who I view these players are as a whole rather than the previous season. But you also have, the MVP lower. So that's also understandable. But I would say go ahead and I will get into Lamar. We only have a 1 spot difference. But, the MVP was good. It was obviously not the strongest MVP, but I think the running game really put him over the top, which is why he won it. It was his best year since his other MVP season. As a thrower, he's hardly in the top 10. I would say that. But again, running is the biggest thing. He still has 5 rushing touchdowns to 6 fumbles, which is kind of scary. But I will say Gus Edwards kind of took a lot of the running touchdowns, and Gus Edwards had like 13 touchdowns, and they were mostly goal line. So you could bump those touchdowns up a little bit. I think the biggest reason he's reached the point he is his passing under pressure. He's the best passer under pressure because he is able to get out of the pocket, but he's still very good in pressure and much better than a lot of people think. And it's not just dump offs. He's 4th in average depth of target, so he's not just doing all these low throws like Purdy is. He had the 2nd worst receiving grade behind the Rams and the Chiefs for offenses that were in the top half of the league, so top 16. He finally had a good playoff game versus Houston. And Kansas City, I don't really think was all his fault. I look at like the Zay Flowers fumble at the goal line, poor penalties by others on offense and defense that led up crucial points for the Chiefs. He obviously had a throw to triple coverage that was bad and a fumble, but he wasn't fully the reason they lost. I think he must have playoff success to keep his ranking. And I think that's kind of why I have him at 4 and other guys ahead of him. He's got 2 MVPs. He has nothing more to prove in the regular season. He's been injured, and when he's been healthy, he's won MVP, literally. Last year, Price should have been their year. It should have been their year, but they have to take advantage of every healthy season because he's I mean, even just the three we're talking about right here, like Lamar's been hurt a ton. Allen is very sturdy, but his play style has been compared obviously back then to Cam, and if he takes all these hits, he might be lower. And Burrow has been injured a ton, so that's really scary for the top, you know, the three guys we're talking about here. But that's kind of my takes on Lamar. What's yours? What do you got him at three?
Oh yeah, I think kind of how I have these three ranked. It's a little bit interchangeable. I think it's you can kind of go by year to year basis,
Yeah,
and I think that's really kind of how I have all three of them ranked. And I guess I'll just start because I kind of have to talk about all three of them to kind of piece in why I have Lamar at three.
that's fine. Yeah,
So Burrow is just the injuries. I think I just can't in good health put him at two when Allen and Lamar just had the seasons that they did, and Burrow was just not on the field. So that's why I have Burrow at four. I think going into last year, I think I had Burrow at two. So just a slight drop off in those top guys, but I mean, in that time, Lamar won an MVP, and Allen had another season over 40 touchdowns. So when that happens, you kind of lose your spot a little bit. So I kind of moved Burrow down, and Lamar. Everything you said is pretty much true. Second MVP, a little bit of a Mickey Mouse MVP. I mean, just a little bit. But at this point, nothing really matters in the regular season for him. It's about postseason success. And I don't know what was the deal in that Kansas City game. I don't know why they didn't run the ball more or run Lamar Jackson. The
yeah, that was an OC
Yeah,
blunder as
the
well.
weak part of the Kansas City defense was their run defense, not their pass defense. And the Ravens just did not attack that. So I think Todd Monken was a reason for that, but Lamar as well. I mean, Lamar's a veteran. He knows, what he can change the play. He can, scramble out, and he just tried to stay and be a pocket passer. So he gets a little bit of blame
It
for that for
didn't.
me.
It didn't
Yeah.
work.
So that's why I have Lamar at three. He got over his playoff hiccups a little bit. Still would have liked to see him at home with the Kansas City Chiefs, not really having player for player as good as a roster as the Ravens did. I don't know. I would have liked to see Lamar win that game. But yeah, I think Lamar at three fits. And then I just think Josh Allen I feel like he's just been carrying the Bills for a few years now. And if they didn't have Allen, they would be I don't even know where they would be. They would just not be a contender. They wouldn't be a playoff team. They would not be. I mean, they were 6-6 last year, and I do think he was a reason for that because of his turnover
And he
mistakes.
was, yeah, he was, and he was also a reason, that they
But I think,
made the
yeah, but
playoffs.
he's also the reason they made the playoffs, and he's also a reason that they have a chance any given Sunday to beat
Yeah,
anybody. I think you just take the good and bad with Allen. Like he's always going to be a guy that
basically.
has a lot of mistakes, but he's also going to be a guy that on any given Sunday could just be the best player on the field, and that's even including Mahomes. Yes, I think at times if Allen is at superhero level, Allen could be playing at a higher level than Mahomes. I do think that is a capability because of how gifted and talented he is. So I just think the kind of way I view it with Mahomes and Allen is just Mahomes is just a more consistent version of Allen. He just has less lows, where Allen just has a lot. You have a lot more variance. So
I think that's partly true. I do think Allen is different in that he's more eager to run,
yeah,
and Mahomes is more eager to throw.
yeah,
Going back to, or I mean, I already talked about Lamar. That's kind of why I have him at between the 4-3-2 is partly and purely based on playoffs. I think you could even put a line with Burrow, between Burrow and then Allen and Lamar. Um, like we said, Lamar has nothing else to prove. We already kind of went over him, but with Josh Allen, like you said, biggest boomer bust play QB. They were 6-6. That was because of him, and then they got out of it because of him. I think that stretch was probably his most impressive. He had like 22 touchdowns during that stretch, including the crazy game in Philly, which they literally lost in overtime.
yeah,
But I think while it's obviously close, especially this MVP year was close, he did win, but I do think he should have won because I think in the beginning of the year, Allen just had way too many turnovers. But I think Allen has just proven more in the playoffs than Lamar did, with Lamar having a better team. It was just, unfortunately, they did both have similar results. But like, I think part of it's also just been like Allen has run into Mahomes, and we obviously all remember that one game, 13 seconds.
Yep.
Allen, if he got the ball, they could have won.
Or if his defense could have
And
held for 13 seconds.
yeah, or that. And I think I just look at because Allen hasn't won an MVP yet, has he? No, which is shocking, and I think could happen any year now. But if I know Lamar is better in the regular season, but he's also been injured more.
Yep.
So that you look at that, but even just looking at playoffs, I just think Lamar has been better. I mean, Allen has been better, but that's a moot point because you have him higher. The biggest discrepancy is Burrow, and I am also doing part, not slight projection, but also just like I'm just so stuck and in love with 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Which I know seems like a while, but it's only been the 1 year difference, which he was hurt again. And that's why I'm very scared. And that's why he's so scary to have here, because the season was ended due to injury. And it ended because he was injured in the very beginning. He was. And it was documented. It was just not very well known. And it was like, it's Burrow, he'll be fine. And he wasn't. It was, I think, his finger or something like that. And it really hurt. He was picking it up, though. Right before the end, I remember the Jamar Chase game because I had him in fantasy, and he killed it, and then he didn't play again. But he, had back-to-back great games versus San Francisco and Buffalo, and then ended up getting injured after that. But just, I think part of the reason for decline in play was also just, again, due to the crappy O-line around him. He was pressured on 1/3 of every pass attempt. His average time to throw was 2.2 seconds. That's one of the lowest in the entire NFL. The O-line in general was around bottom third of the entire league, which I think may also be in part as to why Jake Browning had the lowest average, yard depth of target, because they just had to get the ball out quickly. He had the lowest in terms of quarterback. This is the stat that basically gives you a percentage as to how many times it's a quarterback's fault that they got sacked or pressured, or more so sacked. And Burrow's is 3.7%, which is by far the lowest in terms of what sacks were his fault. And he had, like we just said, 1/3 of every pass attempt was a pressure. So a crazy amount of pressures, and hardly any of them were his fault. He had no help from the run game when he played. When Mixon was playing with him on the field, he was not very good. Mixon had the 5th most carries between weeks 1 and 11 when Burrow was in, and had 4 yards per carry, which was 32nd in the NFL. The only players with a lower yards per carry or PFF grades that were in the top 10 in terms of carries were Josh Jacobs, who had 3 fumbles and 3 yards per carry during that time, had a very down year from his last year, and Alexander Madison, who was horrendous. So didn't have a lot of help from the running game either, and it was just very bad. I know Browning came in and was like, okay, but it was basically Burrow when he was injured. That's kind of what Browning was. And I do expect him to come back healthy and go back to what he was. That's kind of obviously what I'm projecting, having him at number 2. But he needs protection. And hopefully Orlando Brown and Trent Brown can do that and actually stay healthy. But I do understand having him lower, and that's a worry. But I'm just holding on to that year because it's been one of the few times where he has outdueled the number 1. Like, Allen's been close, and that's why he's right below for me. But Burrow literally did it. Like, literally won. And in the Mahomes era of him being there, they've been the only team to get past him.
Yeah.
Which is crazy when you think about it. And it was because he played great. And then he got to the Super Bowl and obviously lost to what I think was a better team in the Rams. And he wasn't bad at all in that game. And Stafford was obviously good. But he's been the only guy to, in the big moment, step up and defeat the one guy above him. It's just, got to stay healthy. And that's kind of what I'm holding on to, is that he has proven it in the playoffs to where he actually did it over the other guys behind him. So that's kind of why I have it like that. Burrow did do it. Allen was very close and similar. Lamar has not really done it yet. But they're all very talented. And that's kind of my stuff for rankings there.
Yeah, I pretty much agree on all points. I think it's going to be fun. All four of these guys are kind of neck and neck. I mean, any given season, any given Sunday could outdo one another. That's what's fun about these elite quarterbacks. But I think any way you have it ordered, I think we can all agree that those are the top four quarterbacks heading into the 2024 season.
Yeah, and then number one, we both had him the same. That is Mahomes. I don't really even have any notes, to be honest. I'm sure I could grab a lot of stuff. But like in the regular season, it wasn't great. At least what we expect from Mahomes. Had some down games. Going into the playoffs, it's like, it might not be their year. I think it looks like the Ravens' year.
Yeah.
They could, do it. And no. Mahomes just freaking does what he does, completely steps it up, and they were just not supposed to win the Super Bowl this year, and they did. And I think that is a gigantic plus to his resume when we look back. And now, years where they are supposed to win the Super Bowl in terms of like their roster is built and like in the perfect time to do it, in terms of where all the contracts meet and everything, it is just going to add on to his legacy even more. And I just think, I mean, even in this playoff run, like the second half or first half, like the Ravens game, he was quiet. Like he was not dotting it up or throwing it down the field. This whole playoff series, he completely changed his style of play to be like, hey, I'm going to manage the game, let my defense do this because we don't have and it worked. He completely changed what he was supposed to be because he's knows what to do, listens to his coaching, and is very smart. And he just completely changed his style of play. And it worked. And I think that's something, and that's why he's in his own bubble, number one. Because he went from an Allen type to a Burrow type. And has won 2 Super Bowls from doing both. And in the Super Bowl was obviously one of his best games, and wasn't insane, but played very, very good, and got another ring. And I think the regular season, his O-line they had the most penalties on the O-line. Didn't have an amazing O-line. Kelsey was having a potentially falling off. The receivers weren't amazing. Rashee Rice was the only guy. Might not even be there next year. We don't even know. But then they go to the playoffs, and he just makes it work. And I know he's got the best coach, but I think they're a perfect duo in their self, just kind of like how Brady and Tom were. And I think the defense helped a ton this year, but he did what it took to win. And I just, it's going to be hard to really see anyone taking him down unless he gets to a point where he's physically falling off.
Yeah, I don't really have much to say. I mean, it's Mahomes. Everybody agrees that, knows what they're talking about, that Mahomes is the best quarterback in the league. I think for the next several years, the Chiefs are going to be the favorite to win the Super Bowl. They're only going to get better. As you mentioned, this wasn't really the year to win it. And, we're watching a legend, already a top 5 quarterback all time, probably play right before our very eyes. So if you kind of are on the fence about liking Mahomes or whatnot, just learn to respect his greatness and just admire kind of what you're watching, because players like him do not come around so often,
if at all. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if he finishes, I don't want to disrespect Brady, but as the GOAT. And if not, probably number 2.
Yeah.
I think if he gets another ring, he's above, Manning, in my opinion, just because of Super Bowl success. But I do think he obviously, if we're being objective talking about the top quarterbacks of all time, needs more regular season success. Just if we're looking at complete awards and MVPs, which Could he win another 2 MVPs in his career? Absolutely. I could totally see that happening. But I just don't see a world where he's not number 1 for the next 10 years,
Yep.
to be honest, which is crazy. But I think everyone knows that anyways. So that was not a shocking end to the list. But
Yep.
that is it for this very long video. We've been recording for hours. I can only imagine what it's going to be in the editing bay. But I hope you enjoyed, Mathis, and I hope that you enjoyed, viewers, in terms of seeing both our lists. This is a yearly thing we're going to do. We did it last year, and I think this was fun. And we can now have, video proof of looking back and seeing how our lists aged poorly or good, and comparing kind of what we thought from last year to this next year. And that's gonna be the end of the video. Of course, I have a podcast. Go ahead and check it out. It's on Spotify. Just type in the same stuff, Stoneheart Sports, and go check out Mathis's channel. Most of you probably already come from his channel, but he's got a bunch of videos going on. He uploads more than I do, so he's got a bunch of Madden stuff and everything over there. So thank you, Mathis, for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the mock as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. It was always
Or not mock. What am I talking about? The list.
Oh yeah.
Sorry,
No, it was fun, definitely, to just, talk about what's going to happen next season and just go through all these quarterbacks. So definitely a good time. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, for sure. More videos to come in the future. We're going to be doing a season prediction that we always do.
Yep.
We'll do it on either his channel or my channel, either one. We'll figure it all out. But I have videos on his channel too, different mock drafts we did. And then on my channel, go ahead and check out the draft rankings, or the just draft grades in general. Went in depth on a ton of the guys in there. So if you want to know a lot about the players that are coming in, go ahead and watch that video. And as always, stay smart, stay sharp, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.